Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most perfectly crafted illusions. Picture this, it's 5 in the morning, 1956. A woman named Barbara wakes up in her suburban home. Her husband is still sleeping. Her children won't wake for another hour, but Barbara doesn't go back to sleep. Instead, she tiptoes to the bathroom, opens a drawer, and pulls out her corset. She laces herself in, applies foundation, paints on her red lipstick, and sets her hair. By the time her family wakes up, she looks perfect. Absolutely perfect. But here's what nobody talks about. She's been awake since 5, struggling to breathe, and she's already taken her first pill of the day. By 1956, 1 in 20 Americans had tried a tranquilizer called Miltown. Most of them were housewives. By 1960, women were taking these pills twice as often as men. Tonight, we're going to uncover what was really hiding behind those perfect red lips and pearl necklaces, and I promise you the truth will change how you see everything. Now, before we dive deeper into this story, I want to ask you something. If this topic intrigues you, if you're curious about the hidden struggles behind history's most polished images, would you consider subscribing to this channel? Maybe hit that like button if you find value in what we explore together. And I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Are you in bed, lights dimmed, ready for a story? Or maybe you're winding down after a long day. Drop a comment and let me know. Your presence here means everything. All right, let's dim those lights a little more, get comfortable, and step back into a world that looked like paradise but felt like a prison for millions of women. Imagine, if you will, opening a magazine in 1955. The pages are filled with images of smiling women. They're wearing perfectly pressed dresses with cinched waists. Their hair is styled in elegant waves. Their homes are spotless. Their children are well behaved. Their husbands are coming home to dinner on the table, a cold drink in hand and a kiss from a wife who looks like she just stepped out of a Hollywood movie. This was the dream being sold to every American woman. This was what they called the feminine mystique. It was everywhere on television shows like Leave It to Beaver, with June Clever, in advertisements for washing machines and vacuum cleaners, in advice columns telling women that their sole purpose in life was to be the perfect wife and mother. And on the surface, it looked beautiful, almost magical, but let me tell you what those magazines didn't show. They didn't show Barbara at 5 in the morning struggling to lace her corset tight enough to create that 18-in waist. They didn't show the bruises on her ribs from the steel bond pressing into her flesh hour after hour. They didn't show her sitting at her kitchen table after everyone left for school and work, staring at nothing, feeling a hollow emptiness she couldn't name and didn't dare talk about. Because if you had everything, a home, a husband, children, a washing machine, what right did you have to feel unhappy? Here's something fascinating and deeply disturbing. In 1957, a woman named Betty Friedan went to her 15th college reunion at Smith College. She was curious about how her classmates were doing. So she created a survey, simple questions about their lives, their happiness, their dreams. What she found shocked her so much that she spent the next 5 years researching it. She interviewed hundreds of suburban housewives across America, and what they told her in whispered voices behind closed doors was heartbreaking. They used phrases like, "I feel empty, somehow incomplete," or "I feel as if I don't exist." One woman told her doctor, "I have a tired feeling. I get so angry with the children. It scares me. I feel like crying with no reason." The doctor in Cleveland called it the housewife syndrome. A family doctor in Pennsylvania had another name for it. He called it the housewife's blight because so many of his female patients came in with great bleeding blisters that would break out on their hands and arms from the stress. Think about that for a moment. These women had everything society told them they should want. They had achieved the dream. They were living in newly built suburban homes with modern appliances. Their husbands had good jobs. Their children were healthy. They had security, comfort, and status, but they were falling apart inside. And the tragedy is each woman thought she was alone. Each woman thought there was something wrong with her because Everywhere she looked, in magazines, on television, in the conversations, at her neighborhood coffee mornings, everyone else seemed happy. Everyone else seemed to be thriving in their role as the perfect housewife. But they weren't thriving. By 1960, thousands of married women were seeking private psychiatric help across the United States. They were being prescribed tranquilizers at alarming rates. The pills had friendly names: Miltown, Valium, Librium. The advertisement showed smiling women with taglines promising that these little pills would help you be a better wife, a better mother, a more patient person. One ad from 1956 actually suggested that Miltown would help frigid women who abhorred marital relations respond more readily to their husband's advances. Can you imagine? The solution to a woman's unhappiness wasn't to address the underlying problem. It was to drug her into compliance. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The beauty industry was booming. Companies like Revlon and Hazel Bishop were investing millions of dollars in television sponsorship. They weren't just selling lipstick and face powder. No, they were selling something much more insidious. They were selling the idea that happiness could be purchased, that fulfillment came from having the right shade of lipstick, the right brand of girdle, the right style of hair. Betty Friedan, in her groundbreaking book, The Feminine Mystique, published in February 1963, put it perfectly. She said that somewhere, somehow, people figured out that women would buy more things if they were kept in a self-hating, ever-failing, hungry, and sexually insecure state of being. As long as women felt they were never quite good enough, never quite pretty enough, never quite perfect enough, they would keep buying, keep trying, keep struggling, and the media played right along. Women's magazines of the 1950s were almost entirely controlled by male editors. These men made the editorial decisions. They decided what stories would be published, and their message was clear. A woman could either be a happy housewife or an unhappy career woman. There was no middle ground. The magazines glorified the stylish makeover as something redemptive, almost holy. They featured articles about how to please your husband, how to raise obedient children, how to keep your home sparkling clean, but they never ever featured articles about women's intellectual pursuits, their career ambitions, or their personal dreams beyond the domestic sphere. Television was even worse. It devoted entire programming blocks to beauty and fashion advice during the daytime hours when housewives would be watching. The shows would bring in Hollywood stars, creating this lavish association between the housewife scrubbing her floors and the glamorous actress on the red carpet. It was aspirational marketing at its most manipulative. The message was clear. You, too, can have this glamour, this beauty, this perfection. All you need is this product, this treatment, this lifestyle. And if you don't achieve it, well, that's your failure. Try harder. Buy more. Be better. Let me paint you a picture of what a typical day actually looked like for women like Barbara. She wakes up at 5 in the morning, as we mentioned. But let's follow her through the day. After putting on her corset and her makeup, she wakes her children. She makes breakfast for the entire family. Eggs, bacon, toast, orange juice, everything must be perfect. Her husband reads the newspaper while she serves him. The children eat quickly before school. After they leave, Barbara cleans the kitchen. Then she starts on the housework. In 1955, before many modern appliances became common, housework was exhausting, endless labor. She washes clothes by hand or with a primitive washing machine. She irons every piece of clothing, including her husband's shirts and the children's school clothes. She scrubs floors on her hands and knees. She dusts every surface. She plans dinner, which needs to be elaborate because a good wife shows her love through cooking. But here's what made it even harder. She's doing all of this while wearing a girdle or corset that restricts her breathing and movement. She's wearing heels even at home because a proper housewife doesn't wear flats. Her hair is perfectly set because, God forbid, her husband or a neighbor sees her looking less than put together, And somewhere around mid-morning, when the house is quiet and she's alone with her thoughts, that hollow feeling creeps in. That voice that asks, "Is this all there is? I went to college. I had dreams. I wanted to be someone, and now I'm just a servant of food and a putter-on of pants and a bedmaker, somebody who can be called on when you want something." That quote, by the way, comes directly from one of the women Betty Friedan interviewed, and it breaks my heart every time I read it. Because this woman had clearly been educated. She was intelligent. She had potential. But society had convinced her that her highest calling, her greatest achievement, should be making sure her family had clean socks and hot meals. Now you might be wondering, why did women accept this? Why didn't they rebel earlier? And that's a really important question. The answer is complicated. After World War II ended, there was this massive cultural push to return to normally. During the war, women had worked in factories building planes and ships. They had proven they could do anything men could do. But when the soldiers came home, those women were fired or pressured to quit. 3 million American women and 1 million British women left the workforce whether they wanted to or not. The government, the media, even religious institutions all sent the same message. A woman's place is in the home. Supporting your husband and raising children is your patriotic duty, your contribution to society, your purpose. And if you didn't feel fulfilled by that purpose, if you felt restless, bored, intellectually starved, well then clearly something was wrong with you. Not with the system, not with the expectations, with you. So women stayed quiet. They smiled. They took their pills. They tried harder to be perfect. They bought the new products. They spent hours at the beauty salon. They competed with their neighbors over who had the greenest lawn, the best-behaved children, the most spotless home. Betty Friedan called this the problem that has no name. And that phrase is so powerful because it captures the essence of what these women were experiencing. It was a problem so pervasive, so universal among housewives, yet so unacknowledged by society that it literally had no name. Women couldn't even articulate what was wrong because there were no words for it in the cultural vocabulary. Oh, F the time. How do you name a feeling of emptiness when you're supposed to be living the dream? How do you express dissatisfaction when you've been told since childhood that being a wife and mother is the greatest achievement a woman can reach? The statistics are staggering when you really look at them. By the end of the 1950s, the average age of marriage had dropped to 20 years old. 14 million girls were getting engaged by age 17. 17. Think about that. These were children really making lifetime commitments before they'd had a chance to discover who they were as individuals. And college, the percentage of women attending college dropped from 47% in 1920 to just 35% in 1958. And of the women who did attend college, 60% dropped out before graduating. Why? To get married. There was actually a term for it, getting your MS degree. The joke being that women went to college, not to get educated, but to find a husband. But here's what haunts me most about this era. The beauty standards, the domestic expectations, the pressure to be perfect, all of that was challenging enough. But the real tragedy was the eraser of women's identities. When the census taker came around, women would proudly write occupation housewife. They had been taught that this was their identity, their value, their contribution to the world. They had been taught to find their worth through their husband's success, their children's achievements, their home's appearance, never through their own accomplishments, their own dreams, their own potential, and society reinforced this constantly. If a woman expressed ambition beyond the home, she was called selfish, unfeminine, or neurotic. Psychologists of the era, heavily influenced by Freudian theory, taught that women who wanted careers were suffering from penis, envy, or had failed to properly embrace their feminine nature. It sounds absurd. Now, I know, but this was mainstream psychological theory at the time. Women were told by doctors, by therapists, by religious leaders, by their own families that their unhappiness was a personal failing, a psychological disorder, something to be treated with medication or therapy aimed at helping them adjust to their proper role. As we close this first chapter of our story, I want you to hold on to something. Behind every perfect image you see, behind every curated life, behind every smile in every photograph, there's a human being with struggles you can't imagine. The housewives of the 1950s looked perfect. Their lives looked enviable, but they were silently drowning. And the tragedy is they were drowning alone. Each one believing she was the only one feeling this way. In our next part, we're going to explore how this situation came to be. How did American women go from building bombers during World War II to being confined to their kitchens by 1955? What forces, what policies, what cultural shifts pushed them back into the home? Because understanding how we got to this point is crucial to understanding why it was so devastating. So stay with me, keep those lights low, get comfortable, because this story is just beginning and it's going to take us places you might not expect. So where did this all begin? How did we get from the image of a capable, independent woman to a housewife who needed pills just to make it through the day? Let me take you back a bit further. Let's rewind to 1942. The United States had just entered World War II, and suddenly everything changed. Men were leaving by the millions to fight overseas. Factories that made cars and refrigerators were now making tanks and airplanes. And those factories needed workers desperately. For the first time in American history, the government was actively recruiting women to join the workforce. Not just any women, but married women. Why? Children. The very women who had been told their entire lives that their place was in the home. And you know what? Women showed up in massive numbers. By 1943, over 3 million American women were working in war industries. In Britain, over 1 million women joined the workforce. These weren't secretaries or telephone operators, though plenty of women did those jobs too. No, these women were welding, riveting, assembling airplane wings, building ships, manufacturing ammunition. They were doing jobs that society had always insisted only men could do, and they were doing them brilliantly. There was this iconic poster, maybe you've seen it, a woman in a red bandana flexing her arm with the words, "We can do it." Above her head, we called her Rosie the Riveter. She became the symbol of female empowerment during the war years. But here's what makes this story so fascinating and so heartbreaking. Women didn't just work in factories. They became engineers, scientists, mathematicians. They flew military aircraft from factories to air bases. They served as mechanics, as electricians, as crane operators. They proved beyond any shadow of doubt that the limitations society had placed on them were artificial, imaginary. Women could do anything men could do, and often they did it just as well or better. And most importantly, many of them loved it. They loved earning their own money. They loved the independence. They loved the sense of purpose and contribution. They loved being seen as capable, skilled individuals rather than just someone's wife or mother. I want you to think about a woman named Helen. This is a real person, by the way, interviewed years later for an oral history project. Helen was 23 years old. In 1942, she'd been married for 2 years and had a 1-year-old daughter. Before the war, she stayed home like she was supposed to. But when the call went out for factory workers, something stirred in her. She applied for a job at a plant that manufactured airplane parts. Her husband wasn't thrilled, but they needed the money, so he agreed. Helen's first day at the factory changed her life. She learned to operate a drill press. She learned to read technical blueprints. She worked alongside other women, and they formed friendships, real friendships built on mutual respect and shared challenges. For the first time in her life, Helen felt like she mattered as an individual, not just as a wife or mother. She was good at her job. She got promoted. She earned her own paycheck. And she told the interviewer decades later that those 3 years working in that factory were some of the happiest of her entire life. Now here's the question. What happened to Helen and millions of women like her when the war ended in 1945? The soldiers came home and suddenly women were no longer needed in the factories, or rather they were no longer wanted. The transformation was shockingly swift and brutally efficient. Within months of the war's end, women were being fired from their jobs or pressured to quit. The government that had begged them to work now told them to go home. The media that had celebrated Rosie the Riveter now started publishing articles about how children were suffering because their mothers were working, how marriages were falling apart because wives were neglecting their duties, how society itself was in danger because women had abandoned their natural roles. Let me give you some numbers that will blow your mind. In the United States, 3 million women were pushed out of the workforce between 1945 and 1947. 3 million. In Britain, 1 million women lost their jobs. These weren't women choosing to leave. Many of them desperately wanted to keep working, but they were given no choice. Employers openly admitted they were firing women to make room for returnee. NG soldiers. Some companies had policies stating that married women could not be employed if their husbands had jobs. Union contracts, negotiated primarily by men, often included clauses prioritizing male workers. The government itself passed policies making it harder for married women to work. For example, many government jobs that had been open to women during the war were now restricted to men only, and the propaganda campaign was relentless. If you picked up a women's magazine in 1946 or 1947, it was like the war years had never happened. Rosie the Riveter disappeared. In her place were images of smiling housewives in aprons, articles with titles like "Should Mothers Work?" and "The Tragedy of the Working Wife." Television shows and movies portrayed working women as either lonely spinsters or neglectful mothers whose children were running wild. The message was clear, and it was everywhere. A good woman, a normal woman, a happy woman stayed home. Working was selfish. Working was unfeminine. Working meant you were failing at your true purpose. Now you might be wondering, did women fight back? Did they protest this massive injustice? Some did, but they faced overwhelming opposition. The culture had shifted so dramatically that speaking out made you a target. You were called unpatriotic because you were supposedly taking jobs away from men who had fought for their country. You were called a bad mother. You were called unfeminine. And here's the really insidious part. Many women started to internalize these messages. They started to believe that maybe they were being selfish. Maybe their children did need them home full time. Maybe their restlessness and dissatisfaction was a personal failing rather than a reasonable response to having their opportunities stripped away. Do you see how brilliant and how cruel this was? Society had asked women to step up during the war. Women had proven they were capable of anything. And then, the moment that capability was no longer convenient, society told them it had all been temporary, an emergency measure, not real life. Real life meant going back to the kitchen. And fashion played a fascinating role in this transformation. In 1947, a French designer named Christian Dior unveiled what he called the new look. After years of wartime austerity, when fabric was rationed and clothes were practical and simple, Dior presented dresses with full skirts that used yards and yards of fabric nipped in waists and a hyper-feminine silhouette. The fashion world went absolutely wild for it, and the new look became a symbol of post-war femininity. It was the opposite of the practical, utilitarian clothing women had worn while working in factories. It was impractical, restrictive, and expensive. You couldn't operate machinery in a new look dress. You couldn't climb a ladder or lift heavy equipment, but that was exactly the point. The new look said, loud and clear, the war is over. Women should go back to being decorative rather than functional, and American women embraced it, or rather, they were told to embrace it. And many did because they wanted to fit in, to be accepted, to avoid the stigma of being unfeminine. Department stores across America rushed to stock new-look fashions. Magazines declared it the height of elegance. To achieve the new-look silhouette, women needed proper foundation garments, which meant corsets and girdles came roaring back after years of being less popular during wartime. The fashion industry, the beauty industry, and the media all worked together, consciously or not, to push women back into a restrictive ideal of femininity. Let me tell you about another woman. Her name was Margaret. She had worked as an electrical engineer during the war, an engineer. She had been one of only a handful of women in her field, and she had excelled. She loved the intellectual challenge, loved solving complex problems, loved being respected for her mind. But in 1946, she was let go. The company told her they needed to make room for returning veterans. Margaret applied to other engineering firms. She was rejected by every single one. The rejection letters, when they bothered to send them, usually said something like, "We don't employ women in technical positions." One letter actually said, "Surely a bright young woman like yourself would prefer to use your talents at home." Margaret eventually gave up. She got married in 1948. She had 3 children by 1954. And when she was interviewed in the 1980s, she said she spent 30 years feeling like she was living someone else's life. She never stopped thinking about engineering problems. She would lie awake at night, mentally designing circuits and systems, but she never got to use that brilliant mind professionally again. And the tragedy is there were thousands of Margarets, thousands of talented, intelligent, capable women whose potential was wasted because society decided their gender mattered more than their abilities. Now, the government's role in all of this cannot be understated. During the war, the government had spent millions on propaganda, encouraging women to work. They created films, posters, and radio programs celebrating female workers. But after the war, that same government machinery was turned in the opposite direction. They funded studies and reports claiming that children whose mothers worked suffered developmental problems. They promoted the idea that juvenile delinquency was caused by working mothers. They provided financial incentives for single INOM families through tax policies. The Veterans Administration gave home loans to returning soldiers, making it possible for millions of families to buy houses in the new suburbs springing up around cities. But these loans were almost exclusively given to men. Women could rarely qualify on their own. And those suburbs, they were specifically designed around the idea of the stay-at-home housewife. Houses were built far from city centers, requiring long commutes. There was little public transportation, few nearby businesses or services. The layout almost guaranteed that women would be isolated at home all day while their husbands commuted to work. It was social engineering through architecture and urban planning. The education system got involved too. Schools and colleges started emphasizing different tracks for boys and girls. Boys took advanced mathematics and science. Girls took home economics and typing. College curricula for women increasingly focused on courses deemed suitable for future wives and mothers. Some colleges even created special programs called marriage and family degrees. I'm not making this up. The idea was to give women a college experience without actually preparing them for careers, because the thinking went they were just going to get married anyway. So why waste resources on serious education for women? And here's where those statistics I mentioned earlier become even more shocking. Remember how I said the percentage of women in college dropped from 47% in 1920 to 35% in 1958? That's not because fewer women wanted to go to college. It's because families stopped seeing the point of educating daughters beyond high school. Why spend money on college when she's just going to get married and have babies? Better to save that money for the sons whose education would actually be used. And of the women who did attend college, 60% dropped out to get married. But here's what often gets overlooked. Many of these women didn't really want to drop out. They felt pressured. Their boyfriends gave them ultimatums. Their parent encouraged them to seize the opportunity of a marriage proposal. Society told them that finding a husband was more important than earning a degree. The average marriage age, plummeting to 20 years old, wasn't random. It was the result of intense cultural pressure. 14 million girls getting engaged by age 17. That's not romance. That's panic. Because women were taught that if they weren't married by their early 20s, they were failures. They were old maids. They will be left behind. So, girls rushed into marriages, often with men they barely knew, because the alternative was social stigma and economic insecurity. Because, let's be honest, in a world where women had limited job opportunities and earned significantly less than men when they could work, marriage was often the only path to financial stability. Think about the cruelty of that system. You take a generation of women who had tasted independence, who had proven their capability, who had earned their own money and made their own decisions, and then you systematically close off every avenue for them to continue doing so. You fire them from their jobs. You deny them educational opportunities. You create housing and transportation systems that isolate them. You bombard them with media messages telling them they should be grateful for the opportunity to dedicate their lives to cooking, cleaning, and childcare. And then, when they feel unhappy or unfulfilled, you tell them the problem is with them. They're neurotic, they're selfish, they're failing at being women. Is it any wonder that by the mid-1950s, so many housewives were struggling with what Betty Friedan would later call the problem that has no name? The foundations of that problem were laid in the late 1940s when women like Helen and Margaret were pushed out of the workforce and told to find fulfillment in domesticity. When their capabilities were denied, our potential was wasted and their dreams were dismissed as unfeminine. So, now we understand how we got here. We've seen the transformation from Rosie the Riveter to June Cleaver, from capable worker to confined housewife. But understanding how it happened doesn't make it any less painful, and it doesn't answer the question of what it actually felt like to live under these impossible standards, because knowing you're supposed to be a perfect housewife is one thing, actually achieving that perfection day after day is something else entirely. The beauty standards alone were enough to break a woman's spirit and her body, and that's exactly where we're going next. We're about to explore the physical reality of pursuing perfection, the measurements women were expected to achieve, and the extreme length they went to in their attempts to meet society's impossible ideals. Stay with me. This is where the story gets even more intense. Let's talk about numbers for a moment, because in the 1950s, women's bodies were measured, calculated, and judged with mathematical precision. There was an actual formula for the perfect woman, and it was everywhere, in beauty pageants, in Hollywood studios, in magazine articles, even in doctors' offices. In 1953, a man named Vincent Trotter, who served as a judge for the Miss Universe pageant, published what he called the ideal proportions for the perfect woman. Are you ready for this? If you are 5 feet 4 inches in tall, your measurements should be 36 in bust, 22 in waist, and 36 in hips. 36, 22, 36. Those numbers became gospel. Women measured themselves against these numbers like their worth depended on it, because in many ways it did. But here's what makes this even more interesting. The beauty ideal had shifted dramatically in just 30 years. Let me take you back to 1921. The first Miss America was crowned that year. Her name was Margaret Gorman. She was 16 years old, and her measurements: she was 5 feet 1 inch in tall, weighed 108 lb, and her measurements were 30 in bust, 25 in waist, and 32 in hips. 30, 25, 32. Now, compare that to the 1950s ideal of 36, 22, 36. Do you see what happened? The bust got bigger, much bigger. The hips got fuller, but the waist got smaller. Society had decided that women should have fuller, curvier bodies, but with an impossibly tiny waist. It was called the hourglass figure, and achieving it naturally was nearly impossible for most women. Let me paint you a picture of what this looked like in real life. Walk with me into a department store in 1955. There's a section for foundation garments. That's what they called undergarments back then. And standing near the girdles and corsets, there's a young woman. Let's call her Susan. She's 22 years old, recently married, and she's shopping for her trousseau, the special wardrobe a new bride was expected to have. Susan picks up a magazine from the display rack. It's open to a page showing a woman who looks like a Hollywood starlet. The caption reads, "Is your figure ready for marriage?" Susan looks at the measurements listed, then she looks down at her own body. She's a healthy, normal young woman, but according to these standards, she's not good enough. Her waist is 26 in, not 22. Her bust is 34 in, not 36. The sales lady approaches with a smile and says, "Don't worry, dear, we can fix that. Let me show you our new line of reshaping corsets. This happened millions of times across America. Women comparing their natural bodies to an artificial ideal. And here's the thing that breaks my heart. Most of these women had perfectly healthy, beautiful bodies, but they were taught to see themselves as flawed, as needing to be fixed, reshaped, and controlled. The hourglass figure wasn't just a preference. It was presented as the only acceptable body type for women. If you are naturally thin, you were told you needed to gain weight in the right places. If you were naturally full, figured without a tiny waist, you needed to cinch it in. There was no body type that was considered acceptable as it naturally existed. And the beauty icons of the era reinforced this constantly. Let's talk about them for a moment, because these women were held up as the absolute standard of beauty. Marilyn Monroe, the ultimate blonde bombshell. Her reported measurements were 37, 23, 36. Elizabeth Taylor, with her violet eyes and legendary beauty. Lana Turner, Diana, Doors, Jane Russell. All of them shared one thing, the hourglass figure. But here's what most people don't know. Many of these Hollywood stars achieve their figures through extremely restrictive foundation garments, careful photography angles, and in some cases, studio-mandated diets and exercise regimens that would be considered unhealthy by today's standards. I want you to think about Marilyn Monroe for a moment. She's become this symbol of curvy beauty, right? And she was genuinely curvy, but she also wore incredibly tight corsets and girdles. She had studio-mandated weigh-ins. She was constantly monitored and controlled, and despite being one of the most beautiful women in the world, she was deeply insecure about her appearance. She struggled with anxiety and depression. She took sleeping pills and other medications. The very woman who represented the beauty ideal was suffering under the pressure of maintaining it. If Marilyn Monroe, Hollywood's golden girl, couldn't feel secure in her own beauty, what hope did ordinary women have? Now, let's talk about why the 1950s celebrated curves when our modern era often celebrates thinness. It's actually fascinating from a cultural perspective. The 1950s hourglass figure was about fertility and femininity in a very traditional sense. A full bust suggested the ability to nurse children. Wide hips suggested the ability to bear children. The tiny waist suggested youth and the absence of pregnancy, showing you were available for marriage or capable of getting your figure back after childbirth. It was all about women's reproductive role. The ideal body wasn't about health or strength or even beauty for its own sake. It was about advertising your suitability for marriage and motherhood. And Hollywood played this up brilliantly. Every romantic comedy, every drama, every film reinforced the message. The beautiful woman, the desirable woman, the woman who got the man, always had the hourglass figure. Think about the movies from this era. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes with Marilyn Monroe and Jane Russell in 1953. Both women are shown in costumes that emphasize their curves, particularly their waists and busts, or the Merry Widow from 1952 with Lana Turner. The movie literally featured her wearing elaborate corsets, and it sparked a fashion trend. Women rushed out to buy Merry Widow-style corsets because they wanted to look like Lana Turner. Never mind that Lana Turner was wearing a costume, not her everyday clothes. Never mind that she had a team of people helping her look perfect on camera. Women saw the image and thought, I need to look like that. But here's where it gets really cruel. While Hollywood promoted these curvy icons, they also promoted an extremely narrow version of what curves should look like. Not just Any curves, very specific curves. If you carried weight in your stomach, that was unacceptable. If you had heavy thighs or thick ankles, that was a flaw. If your bust was large but sagged naturally rather than being perky and high, that needed to be corrected with the right brazier. The ideal was so specific, so particular that almost no woman could achieve it without artificial help. Let me tell you about a woman named Dorothy. She shared her story years later as part of an oral history project. Dorothy was a teenager in the 1950s. She was naturally athletic, strong with broad shoulders and a straight figure rather than an hourglass. She was healthy. She was active. But when she looked at magazines, when she watched movies, when she compared herself to the beauty standards of her time, she felt like a failure as a woman. Her mother took her to a special clinic that promised to help girls develop more feminine figures. There, Dorothy was put on a diet designed to add weight to specific areas. She was given exercises that supposedly would redistribute her body fat. She was measured weekly, and she was made to feel that her natural body was wrong, defective, unfeminine. Now, imagine being Dorothy. Imagine being a young woman whose body is perfectly healthy, but society tells you it's wrong. That psychological damage doesn't just go away. Dorothy struggled with body image issues her entire life. Even in her 70 seconds when she told this story, you could hear the pain in her voice 70 years later. And she still remembered how it felt to be told her body was unacceptable. And the magazines made it worse, so much worse. Women's magazines in the 1950s ran constant articles about beauty and figure. But here's the insidious part. The articles would show these gorgeous photographs of models with perfect hourglass figures. Then the text would say something like, "Any woman can achieve this with dedication and the right foundation garments." Any woman. As if it was just a matter of trying hard enough. As if your natural body type was something you could overcome through sheer willpower and the right products. It was gaslighting on a cultural scale. There were actually advertisements, I'm not making this up, for products that promised to help women who were too skinny develop curves. Powders you could take or gain weight in the right places. Special exercises to enlarge your bust, padded girdles to add fullness to your hips. And on the flip side, there were products for women who were too fat to reduce their waistlines. The message was clear: whatever body you have, it's wrong. But don't worry, we can sell you something to fix it. Can I ask you something? Have you ever felt that pressure? Maybe not about having a 22 in waist, but about fitting some impossible standard. I think we can all relate to that feeling even today. But imagine if that pressure came at you from every direction every single day, with no escape. That was life for women in the 1950s. Let me share something that really struck me while researching this. There was a study done in the late 1950s where researchers asked women how they felt about their bodies. Over 80% said they were dissatisfied with their figure. Even women whose measurements were close to the ideal expressed dissatisfaction. Because when you set perfection as the standard, no one ever measures up. There's always something to improve, something to fix, something to change. And that constant dissatisfaction, that endless striving for an unattainable goal, that's exhausting, it's demoralizing, it steals your joy and your energy. And here's another layer to this. The beauty standards weren't just about the numbers, they were also about class and race. The ideal woman portrayed in magazines and movies was almost exclusively white middle class or wealthy women of color, working class women, immigrant women. They were largely invisible in mainstream beauty culture, or when they were portrayed, it was often in stereotypical or demeaning ways. The 1950s beauty ideal was narrow in every sense. Narrow waist, narrow definition of beauty, narrow inclusion of who could even be considered beautiful. For black women, the pressure was even more complex and painful. They faced beauty standards that essentially told them their natural features were unacceptable. Chemical relaxers for hair became increasingly popular in the 1950s. These were harsh chemicals that straightened naturally curly or kinky hair. Why? Because straight hair, European hair, was considered beautiful. Curly natural black hair was considered unprofessional, unkempt, or unattractive. Asian American women, Latina women, Native American women, they all face similar pressures to conform to a white European standard of beauty. The hourglass figure might have been hard to achieve for white women, but at least they were included in the conversation. Women of color often weren't even allowed in the room. Now, the hourglass obsession affected different aspects of women's lives in interesting ways. Take fashion, for instance. Everything in the 1950s was designed to emphasize or create that hourglass shape. Full-circle skirts with petticoats underneath made hips look wider. Fitted bodices emphasized the bust and cinched the waist. Even casual clothing like sweater sets were designed to be form-fitting. There was no such thing as loose, comfortable clothing for women. Even at home doing housework, women were expected to wear dresses that showed their figure. Pants were considered unfeminine and inappropriate for most occasions. Can you imagine scrubbing floors in a fitted dress and heels? But that was the expectation. And dating in the 1950s, oh boy, young women were explicitly told that their figure was their greatest asset in attracting a husband. Dating advice columns would say things like, "Make sure your waist looks tiny when he puts his arm around you," or "Wear clothing that shows off your feminine curves." A woman's personality, her intelligence, her sense of humor, those were secondary. The first thing a man noticed, the thing that mattered most, as supposedly her figure. So teenage girls, young women, they obsessed over their measurements. They compared themselves to each other constantly. They felt intense competition and jealousy. Because if having the right figure was the key to getting married, and getting married was the key to a successful life, then your body measurements literally determined your future. There's this heartbreaking quote I came across from a woman's diary from 1956. She was 19 years old. She wrote, "I measured myself again today. Still 24 in around the waist. I have to get it down to 22 before the summer dance. If I don't, Robert will never notice me. Sometimes I wish I could just disappear. If I can't be beautiful, what's the point?" She was 19 with a 24-in waist, which is already incredibly slim, and she felt like a failure. She felt like life wasn't worth living if she couldn't shrink her body by 2 more inches. That's the real cost of impossible. Beauty standards. Not just the physical discomfort, though that was significant. Not just the money spent on products and treatments, though that was substantial. The real cost was psychological. It was women learning to hate their own bodies. Women believing their worth was determined by their measurements. Women sacrificing their health, their comfort, their time, and their mental well-being in pursuit of an ideal that wasn't even real. Because here's the secret they didn't tell women. Those perfect figures, in the magazines, they were often achieved through photo manipulation. Even back then, strategic lighting, careful posing, even airbrushing existed in the 1950s, though it was done manually on photographic negatives. The Hollywood stars, they had personal trainers, dietitians, and costume designers whose entire job was to make them look perfect. They were wearing foundation garments that were custom-made to create that silhouette. The ideal that ordinary women were comparing themselves to wasn't even attainable for the women who supposedly embodied it without massive amounts of help, money, and manipulation. So we've seen the numbers. We've seen the ideal. We've met women like Susan and Dorothy who struggled under these impossible standards. But understanding what women were supposed to look like is only half the story. Because achieving that look, or attempting to achieve it, that required daily effort, hours of effort. And that effort came with its own set of challenges, its own beauty rituals, and its own forms of suffering. So, let's step into that world now. Let's follow a woman through her daily beauty routine in the 1950s and discover just how much time, energy, and pain went into looking perfect. Because the hourglass figure was just the goal, the journey to try to reach it. That's where things get really intense. Picture a typical Tuesday morning in 1957. The alarm clock rings at 5:30 in the morning. Most people would hit snooze, right? But for a housewife named Joan, this is when her real workday begins. Not with breakfast for the family, not with household chores. No, Joan's day begins with beauty. Because by the time her husband wakes at 7, by the time her children stumble into the kitchen at 7:30, Joan needs to look like she just stepped out of a magazine. And achieving that look, that takes time. A lot of time, more time than you might imagine. Walk with me through Joan's morning. She's 30 years old, married for 8 years, with 2 children, aged 6 and 4. She pads quietly to the bathroom, trying not to wake anyone. First the bath. Not a quick shower. Mind you, showers were less common in homes back then, and besides, a proper lady took baths. Joan runs the water, careful to keep it warm but not hot, because hot water was said to be bad for the complexion. She uses Palm Eve soap and Al purpose bar that promised to keep skin soft and youthful. The bath itself takes about 20 minutes but is not relaxing. Joan is mentally going through her checklist. After bathing, she needs to apply moisturizer, then foundation, then powder. Her hair needs to be set. Her eyebrows need to be plucked and penciled. Her lips need to be lined and filled. So much to do before the house wakes up. Let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you spent 2 hours getting ready in the morning? Maybe for a really special occasion, right? A wedding, perhaps? Well, for women like Joan, this was every single day. Every day was a special occasion because every day required looking perfect. Can you imagine the exhaustion of it? The relentlessness of it? After her bath, Joan stands in front of her bathroom mirror and begins the transformation. First, the foundation. The 1950s beauty ideal called for what they termed the mask effect. Your skin should look porcelain smooth, absolutely flawless, with no natural variation in tone. To achieve this, women use thick cream foundations, and I mean thick. These weren't the lightweight, breathable foundations we have today. These were heavy, opaque products that literally created a mask over your natural skin. Joan applies it carefully with her fingers, making sure to cover every inch of her face and neck. The coverage has to be even, absolutely even. Any streaks or patches would be visible, and that was unacceptable. On top of the foundation goes powder, flesh-colored powder pressed onto the foundation with a puff. This set the makeup and created that matte finish that was so popular. Your skin should never look shiny or dewy. That was considered oily and unattractive. No, your face should look smooth and powdered, almost dull-like. The entire base makeup process takes Joan about 15 minutes, and we haven't even gotten to the yes and lips yet. Now comes the artistry. Joan picks up her eyebrow pencil. Eyebrows in the 1950s were a big deal. They needed to be perfectly arched, well-defined, and symmetrical. Natural bushy brows were out. Thin, elegant arches were in. Many women plucked their eyebrows almost bare and then drew them back on with pencil. Joan is lucky. She kept more of her natural brow, but she still needs to shape and define them every single morning. This takes another 10 minutes because getting both eyebrows to match perfectly is harder than it looks. Then the eyes themselves. This is where things get really interesting. The signature eye look of the 1950s was all about drama. First, eyeshadow, usually a single pastel color, pale pink, soft blue, light, green, yellow, or brown. Joan chooses a pale pink today. She applies it across her entire eyelid with a small brush. Then comes the eyeliner. And not just any eyeliner, the winged liner, the cat eye that has become iconic when we think of 1950s beauty. Creating that perfect wing takes skill and patience. Joan has been doing this for years, so she's gotten pretty good at it. But even so, it takes several attempts to get both eyes matching. One wing too thick, wipe it off and start over. One wing angled differently than the other. Fix it. This process alone can take 15 to 20 minutes on a difficult morning. Finally, mascara. Joan uses a cake mascara, which means she has to wet a small brush and rub it on a compact of mascara cake to create the product. Then she carefully applies it to her lashes, building up several coats to create that defined, dramatic lash line. No clumps allowed, no smudges permitted. Another 10 minutes, let's add this up so far. 20 minutes for the bath, 15 minutes for foundation and powder, 10 minutes for eyebrows, 20 minutes for eyeshadow and eyeliner, 10 minutes for mascara. That's already 75 minutes. An and 15 minutes. And Joan hasn't even touched her lips or her hair yet. The lips. Oh, the lips. Red lipstick was not optional in the 1950s. It was mandatory. The perfect housewife wore red lipstick even when doing dishes, even when vacuuming, even when playing with her children in the backyard. Red lips were a symbol of femininity, of glamour, of being put together. But achieving the perfect red lip required technique. First, Joan lined her lips with a lip pencil, creating a precise outline. This was crucial because the lipstick needed to stay within strict boundaries. A perfectly shaped lip was part of the ideal. Then she fills in with her lipstick, usually applying 2 or 3 coats for rich, even color. Then she blots with a tissue, powders over the lipstick, and applies another coat. This layering technique helped the lipstick last longer. The entire lip routine takes about 10 minutes. Now we're at 85 minutes, nearly an hour and a half, and we still haven't addressed Joan's hair. Hair in the 1950s was elaborate. There was no such thing as wash and go, no sleek ponytails or messy buns, at least, not for married women. Your hair needed to be styled, really styled. The most popular looks included the bouffant, the page boy bob, the Italian, cut with soft curls, the pixie cut, or the high ponytail with flipped ends for younger women. Whatever the style, it required setting. Most women set their hair in rollers or pin curls the night before. Joan did this last night, so this morning she carefully removes the bobby pins and rollers. Then she brushes through the curls, teases sections for volume, and uses hairspray to hold everything in place. Hairspray wasn't the light, flexible product we have now. It was sticky and strong, designed to lock your hair into position all day long. Styling her hair takes Joan another 20 to 30 minutes total time, nearly 2 hours. 2 hours every eerie single morning just to look acceptable. And this was standard. This wasn't Joan being excessively vain or unusually high maintenance. This was what was expected of every housewife who wanted to be considered well-groomed and respectable. But wait, there's more. Because the daily routine was just the beginning. Once a week, sometimes twice a week, women went to the beauty salon. And those visits were significant time commitments. According to records and surveys from the ERA, the average housewife spent 2 to 3 hours per week at the beauty salon. 2 to 3 hours. What were they doing there for so long? Let me take you inside a typical beauty salon visit in 1955. There's actually archival footage from this period, a film called A Visit to a 1950s Beauty Salon that shows exactly what these appointments entailed. Women would arrive at their appointed time and spend hours undergoing various treatments, not just haircuts or styling, though that was part of it. No, these women were getting full beauty treatments. One popular treatment was the paraffin wrap. Hot paraffin wax was melted and then your hands or feet were dipped into it multiple times, creating layers of wax that encased your skin. You would sit there for 20 or 30 minutes while the wax cooled and hardened. Then the beautician would peel it off, supposedly leaving your skin soft and rejuvenated. Did it work? Maybe a little. Was it necessary? Absolutely not. But women were told it was essential for maintaining youthful hands. Another treatment was the seaweed bath. You would soak in a tub filled with water and seaweed extracts. The claim was that the minerals in seaweed would detoxify your body and improve your skin. Women would lie in these baths for 30 to 40 minutes. Then there were suction cup massages where rubber cups would be placed on your face and body, creating suction to supposedly improve circulation and fur. And steaming facials where your face would be covered with hot towels or placed over a steam machine to open your pores before they applied various creams and masks. The beautician was a highly trained professional. She had learned as an apprentice about facial structure, skin, types, and beauty techniques. This was a respected and lucrative profession. But here's the thing. Many of these treatments sound like torture when you really think about them. Hot wax, suction cups, hours lying still while someone smears various potions on your face, all in the pursuit of beauty, all because women were told this was necessary to maintain their appearance and by extension their value, and it wasn't cheap. Oh no, beauty salon visits could range from a few dollars for basic services to $25 or more for extensive treatments. In today's money, that $25 would be equivalent to about $250. Some women were spending the equivalent of several hundred per month on beauty salon visits alone. For many families, this represented a significant portion of their household budget. Now, let's talk about hair specifically because hair maintenance in the 1950s was its own special kind of commitment. The elaborate hairstyles we see in photographs from this era, those didn't just happen. They required constant maintenance. Most women had their hair professionally, styled at the salon once a week, but maintaining that style between salon visits, that required nightly effort. Women slept in rollers or pin curls almost every night. Imagine trying to sleep comfortably with your head covered in hard plastic rollers or metal bobby pins. It was uncomfortable at best, painful at worst, but necessary. During the day, hair had to be protected and preserved. Women carried hairspray in their purses for touch-ups. They avoided activities that might mess up their hair. Wind was an enemy. Rain was a disaster. Exercise. Forget about it. You couldn't work up a sweat because that would ruin your hairstyle. This is one of the reasons why fitness culture wasn't big for women in the 1950s. How could you exercise when maintaining your hairstyle was a full-time job? And the products, oh my goodness, the products. Let me tell you about some of the major brands that dominated the 1950s beauty industry. For drugstore, cosmetics, Revlon was the giant. Max Factor was another major player. Pond's was everywhere, known for their cold cream and face powder. For luxury products, you had Estee Lauder, Elizabeth Arden, and Helena Rubinstein. These brands weren't just selling products. They were selling a lifestyle, a promise, a dream. The advertisement showed sophisticated, beautiful women living glamorous lives. The implication was clear. Buy our products and you too can have this life, this beauty, this happiness. The advertising was relentless and everywhere. Television had created a new opportunity for beauty companies. For the first time, they could advertise during daytime programming when housewives were the primary audience. They sponsored soap operas and cooking shows. They created commercials that showed women using their products and immediately becoming more attractive, more confident, more desirable to their husbands. One particularly memorable ad campaign from Revlon suggested that using their lipstick could save your marriage. Can you believe that? Your marriage success depended on your choice of lipstick. Let me share something that really illustrates the absurdity of all this. There was a woman named Ethel who was interviewed years later about her life in the 1950s. She remembered spending so much time on beauty and grooming that she barely had time for anything else. She said, and, I'm paraphrasing here, that between the daily makeup routine, the weekly salon visits, the nightly high, our setting, the constant maintenance and upkeep, she was spending at least 15 to 20 hours per week on her appearance alone. 15 to 20 hours. That's basically a part-time job, except she wasn't getting paid. She was paying in time, in money, in energy. Ethel said something that really stuck with me. She said, I sometimes wondered what I could have done with all those hours if I'd been allowed to spend them differently. I could have read books, learned a new language, taken a class, developed a skill, but instead I spent them in front of a mirror trying to look perfect for people who probably didn't even notice the effort. And that's the tragedy, isn't it? All this time, all this effort, all this money and energy poured into maintaining an appearance that was never quite good enough. Because even if you achieve perfection, today you had to do it all over again the next day. There was no finish line, no moment when you could say, okay, I'm beautiful enough now, I can stop. The pursuit of beauty was endless, exhausting, and ultimately futile, because the standards kept changing, kept demanding more. Think about what women could have accomplished with those hours. If the average housewife spent 15 hours per week on beauty maintenance, that over 750 hours per year, that's more than 30 full days. A full month of a woman's life every single year spent on appearance. What books could have been written? What businesses could have been started? What education could have been pursued? What creative works could have been produced? We'll never know, because that time was spent creating the mask of perfection that society demanded. And here's something that might surprise you. Despite all this effort, despite all these hours and all this money, many women still didn't feel beautiful. They still felt inadequate. Because when perfection is the standard, no amount of effort is ever enough. There's always something to improve. Your lipstick could be a better shade. Your eyebrows could be more perfectly arched. Your hair could have more volume. The beauty industry was brilliant at creating perpetual dissatisfaction, ensuring that women would keep buying, keep trying, keep spending. But all of this, everything we've talked about so far, the measurements, the makeup, the hair, the salon visits, all of it, depended on one crucial element. The foundation, quite literally, upon which the entire beauty ideal was built. And that foundation was the undergarments women wore every single day. The corsets and girdles that shaped their bodies, that created those impossible silhouettes that made everything else possible. Because you could have the perfect makeup and the perfect hair, but if you didn't have the right figure underneath, your clothes, none of it mattered. And achieving that figure, that came with its own special kind of suffering. A physical pain that women endured in silence every single day, from morning until night. That's where we're heading next, into the most intimate, most painful, most hidden part of the perfect housewife's daily experience. Get ready, because this is where the real torture begins. There's something most people don't realize about the 1950s fashion. Silhouette, that perfectly cinched waist, those smooth lines under dresses, that flawless hourglass shape. None of it was natural. All of it was constructed, engineered really. And the engineering happened beneath the surface, hidden under layers of fabric where no one could see the mechanisms of transformation. Let me introduce you to the foundation garments of the 1950s, the instruments of beauty that were quite literally instruments of torture. Before we go deeper, I need you to understand something. When I say these garments were uncomfortable, I don't mean like wearing shoes that are a bit too tight. I mean genuine, daily, persistent physical pain that women simply learned to endure because they had no choice. Are you sitting comfortably right now? Good. Try to remember that feeling, because as we explore this topic, you're going to be very grateful for whatever comfortable clothing you're wearing. Let's start with the basics. The foundation garment world of the 1950s had a hierarchy. At the bottom, so to speak, were girdles. Think of girdles as the everyday practical option. They were made from elasticized fabrics, usually with some bond for structure, but primarily relying on the power of elastic to compress and shape the body. Girdles were what you wore on a regular Tuesday while doing housework or running errands. They provided light to moderate shaping, smoothing out your natural curves into the acceptable silhouette. A basic girdle could cost anywhere from $2 to about $10, which in today's money would be roughly $20 to $100. But girdles were just the foundation for special occasions, for achieving that truly dramatic hourglass figure. Women reached for something more powerful, the corset. Now, 1950s corsets were different from the Victorian corsets you might imagine. They had evolved, but they were still serious business. These weren't delicate lingerie items. They were structured, garments with significant bond, either plastic or in some cases still metal, designed to dramatically reshape the torso. And the most popular style, the one that captured the imagination of the era, it was called the Merry Widow. The Merry Widow corset has a fascinating origin story. In 1952, a movie came out starring Lana Turner called The Merry Widow. In the film, Lana wore these stunning, elaborate corsets as part of her costume. The public went absolutely wild for them. Whereas a major lingerie company saw an opportunity. They registered the name Merry Widow and launched an entire line of corsets with the film's release. From the mid-1950s to the early 1960s, these corsets were everywhere. Every woman wanted one because they wanted to look like Lana Turner. Never mind that Lana Turner was wearing a costume designed by Hollywood professionals. Never mind that she only wore it for filming, not all day, every day. The fantasy was irresistible. A Merry Widow corset was typically strapless or had removable straps. It covered from the bust down to the hips, incorporating bra cups at the top and significant bond throughout to create that extreme hourglass shape. And they were expensive. A high-quality Merry Widow could cost $25 or more in the 1950s, which translates to over $250 in today's currency. For really top-of-the-line, custom corsets designed specifically for an individual woman's body, you could be looking at prices equivalent to over $1,000 today. This was serious money for a single undergarment. Now, let's talk about what it actually felt like to wear these things. I want you to meet a woman named Patricia. She's someone whose testimony was recorded in an oral history project decades later, and her description of wearing foundation garments in the 1950s is both vivid and heartbreaking. Patricia says she was expected to be fully dressed, foundation garments, and all before her husband woke up. So, like our friend Joan from earlier, she would rise early. But the process of getting into a corset or even a substantial girdle wasn't quick or easy. First, you needed to prepare your body. Many women dusted themselves with talcum powder to help the garment slide on more easily, especially in hot weather. Can you imagine? It's summer, you're already warm, and you're about to encase your entire torso in thick elastic and bond. Then came the actual process of putting the garment on. For a step-in girdle, which was the easier option, you would fold the top down by several inches, step into it, and then gradually work it up your body. It was like pulling on the world's tightest pair of pants, except these pants were meant to compress your entire midsection. You would wiggle and tug and pull, and once you got it up to your waist, you'd unfold that top section and roll it into place. Patricia describes the moment the girdle finally settled into position. She said, "It felt like someone had wrapped a strap around her middle and pulled it tight, not painfully tight, not at first, but tight enough that you were constantly aware of it, tight enough that taking a deep breath was impossible. You could only take shallow breaths because your ribs couldn't expand fully, and this was considered normal. This was just what wearing proper undergarments felt like, but girdles were the comfortable option compared to serious corsets. Putting on a bone corset was a production. Some of them laced up the back, which meant you either needed help or incredible flexibility and patience to lace yourself in. Others had hook and eye closures or zippers, which was slightly easier but still challenging. The key was getting it tight enough, not so tight that you couldn't T-function at all, but tight enough to create that dramatic shape. And here's the thing that really gets me. Women were taught to take pride in how tightly they could lace their corsets. There was this culture of competitive tight lacing where having a smaller corseted waist was a point of pride. Never mind that it was cutting off your circulation and compressing your organs. If it made your waist smaller, it was worth it. Let me tell you what these garments did to women's bodies, and I don't mean the unintended effect of shaping the silhouette. I mean the unintended consequences, the health problems that nobody talked about in the glossy magazines. First breathing, tight corsets and girdles restricted the expansion of the rib cage. This meant women couldn't take deep breaths. They were essentially in a state of chronic mild oxygen deprivation. This led to fatigue, dizziness, and a general feeling of being unwell. Women fainted more frequently in the 1950s, and while popular culture attributed this to feminine delicacy, the real reason was often simply that they couldn't breathe properly. Then were digestive issues. When you compress the abdomen, you're compressing all the organs in there, including the stomach and intestines. This led to acid, reflux, constipation, and general digestive discomfort. Women dealt with heartburn constantly. They had trouble eating normal-sized meals because there simply wasn't room for their stomachs to expand. So they ate smaller portions, which everyone interpreted as feminine delicacy and proper eating habits. But really, they were hungry. They just couldn't eat more without feeling sick. The physical pressure on the ribcage caused bruising. Women would have marks and bruises on their sides and back from the bond pressing into their flesh, hour after hour, day after day. Some women developed permanent indentations in their ribs. Patricia, the woman I mentioned earlier, said that even decades after she stopped wearing girdles and corsets, she could still see the slight deformation in her ribcage where the bond had pressed in for years. Her body had literally been reshaped by these garments, and not in the temporary way that was intended. In a permanent way, the bones of her body had been affected. Muscle stiffness was another major issue. When you hold your torso rigid all day, every day, the muscles don't work naturally. They atrophy. They become weak. Women who wore these garments for years found that without them, their backs and abdomen felt weak and unsupported. The very garments that were supposed to provide support had actually weakened their natural muscle structure. It's ironic and cruel. The corset becomes necessary because wearing it has made your body dependent on it. And then there were the more serious health problems. Over time, excessive compression could lead to organ displacement. The liver, in particular, could be pushed downward and compressed. The uterus could be affected. There are medical reports from era documenting women who suffered long-term health consequences from years of wearing overly tight foundation garments. But these reports were often dismissed or ignored. After all, beauty required sacrifice, right? A little discomfort was a small price to pay for looking feminine and attractive. Let me share a story that really illustrates the extreme lengths women went to. There was a subculture even within the already restrictive 1950s of women who practiced extreme tight lacing. These were women who gradually reduced their waist size over months and years by wearing increasingly tight corsets for increasing amounts of time. They would start by wearing a corset for a few hours a day, laced moderately tight. Then they would increase the time and the tightness. Eventually, some of these women were wearing corsets 24 hours a day, only removing them to bathe and their waists. Some claim to achieve 16-in or even 14-in waists. Now, you might think this was rare, a fringe behavior, and yes, extreme tight lacing was not the norm. But the fact that it existed at all, that it was discussed in magazines and mentioned in social circles, shows how far the obsession with the tiny waist had gone. These extreme tight laces were held up as examples of dedication, of commitment to beauty. They weren't condemned as harming themselves. They were sometimes admired. But let's get back to the average woman's experience. Because even without extreme tight lacing, the daily wearing of foundation garments took a toll. Think about it from a practical standpoint. You wake up, you put on your girdle or corset. Now you're going to wear it for the next 12 to 16 hours, through all your daily activities. Cooking, which involves bending and reaching. Cleaning, which involves scrubbing and stretching. Playing with children, which involves bending down and picking them up. Grocery shopping. Walking. Sitting. All of this while your torso is compressed and your breathing is restricted and there was no break. You couldn't take it off in the afternoon when you got uncomfortable. What if your husband came home early? What if a neighbor dropped by? You needed to be properly dressed, properly shaped at all times. Patricia mentions in her testimony that she would sometimes lock herself in the bathroom for a few minutes in the afternoon, loosen her girdle just slightly to catch her breath, and then retighten it before anyone noticed. Those stolen moments of relief were precious. They were also necessary just to get through the day. Now, let's talk about the different types of foundation garments in more detail, because the variety is actually fascinating. There were full corsets which covered from bust to hip or even mid-thigh. There were corselettes, which were a more modern version combining a bra and a waist cincher in one garment. There were waspies, which were just waist cinches focusing only on creating that tiny waist. There were girdle corset hybrids that combined the flexibility of elastic with the structure of bone. And then there were the bras themselves, which deserve their own mention. The iconic bra style of the 1950s was the bullet bra, also called the pointed bra or sweater girl bra. These bras had conical pointed cups that created a very distinctive silhouette under clothing. They were heavily padded and structured, with stitching that created and maintained that pointed shape. The goal was to make the breasts appear larger, higher, and more dramatically shaped than they naturally were. And like everything else, these bras weren't comfortable. The padding was thick, the underwire for styles that had it dug into the rib cage. The straps often left marks on shoulders from carrying the weight of all that structure and padding. Then there were long-line bras, which extended down past the bust to the waist, providing both bust support and some waist shaping. These often came with bond and were strapless, so they could be worn with the evening gowns and cocktail dresses that were popular for special occasions. A woman might wear a long-line bra with a separate girdle, and the two garments would attach to each other with little hooks or tabs to prevent them from separating and creating gaps or bunching. Can you imagine two separate, restrictive garments that had to be perfectly coordinated and attached to each other? And we haven't even talked about stockings yet. Pantyhose didn't exist in the 1950s. Women wore stockings, individual stockings for each leg that had to be held up somehow. Enter the garter belt or the garter straps attached to the girdle or corset. These were elastic or ribbon straps with metal or plastic clips that would attach to the top of each stocking. You needed at least 4 garter straps, 2 for each leg, to keep the stockings up properly. And if a garter strap broke or came unclipped during the day, your stocking would start sliding down, which was both uncomfortable and embarrassing. You would need to excuse yourself, find a private place, reach up under your dress or skirt, and refasten the garter to the stocking, all while wearing a restrictive girdle or corset that made bending difficult. Let me ask you something. Have you ever worn shapewear? Maybe Span or something similar? If you have, that feeling of finally taking it off at the end of the day, that sense of relief, of being able to breathe fully again, of letting your body relax into its natural shape. Now, imagine that feeling, but multiply it by 10 because what you were wearing was 10 times more restrictive. That's what it was like for women in the 1950s when they finally got to take off their foundation garments at night. Patricia describes it as one of the best moments of her day. She would go to her bedroom, close the door, and slowly remove all the layers. The relief was almost physical pain in reverse. As the pressure released, as blood flow returned to normal, as her organs could settle back into their natural positions, she would sometimes feel dizzy or lightheaded. Her body would ache from having been held rigid all day. She would have red marks and indentations all over her torso from the elastic and bond, and the next morning she would have to do it all over again. Now here's something that adds another layer to this story. The girdle and corset industry was brilliant at marketing these garments not as tools of oppression but as helpers, as your friends in achieving beauty. The advertisements showed smiling women comfortable and confident in their foundation garments. Brand names like Playx emphasized flexibility and comfort. The living girdle, they called it, suggesting it moved with you, breathed with you. But it didn't, not really. It was still a restrictive garment designed to compress your body into an unnatural shape, but the marketing was so effective that women believed or wanted to believe that these garments were beneficial, even necessary. And in a way, they were necessary, not for health reasons obviously, but for social reasons, because if you didn't wear proper foundation garments, it showed your clothes didn't fit right, your silhouette wasn't smooth and shaped, you looked, in the language of the time, sloppy or improper. So women wore these garments not just because they wanted to, but because they had to, because not wearing them meant social judgment and criticism. It meant failing to meet the standard of what a respectable woman should look like. The tragic irony is that these garments marketed as beautifying were actually harmful. They caused real physical damage. They restrict head movement and breathing. They weakened muscles. They displaced organs. They caused pain and discomfort. But because all of this happened hidden under clothing, because women didn't openly discuss these problems, because admitting to discomfort was seen as complaining or being weak, the cycle continued. Each generation of women taught the next generation that this was normal. This was what you did. This was the price of being a woman. Patricia's testimony includes a moment that really struck me. She talks about her daughter, who was a teenager in the 1960s. The daughter refused to wear girdles and corsets. She was part of the youth rebellion, the counterculture that rejected the rigid gender roles of the previous generation. Patricia remembers being shocked, even upset that her daughter wouldn't wear proper foundation garments. She had spent so many years believing these garments were necessary, suffering in them because she thought she had to, that seeing her daughter reject them felt almost like a betrayal of everything she had endured. But then, Patricia says she saw her daughter living freely, moving comfortably, breathing deeply, and she realized what she'd been missing her entire adult life. That realization brought grief for all those years of unnecessary suffering, but it also brought a kind of bittersweet joy that her daughter wouldn't have to go through the same thing. So, we've explored the daily beauty routine, the hours spent on makeup and hair. We've examined the foundation garments, the physical structures that literally shaped women's bodies. But all of this effort, all this time and money and pain, it was in service of something larger, a massive industry that had discovered the most profitable product in the world wasn't an object. It was insecurity. And in the 1950s, that industry reached its golden age, turning women's self-doubt into billions of dollars. That's the machinery we need to examine. Next, the beauty industry itself, how it operated, how it sold its products, and, most importantly, how it kept women trapped in a cycle of perpetual inadequacy and constant purchasing, because once you understand the system, you can start to see how deliberate it all was. Here's what nobody tells you about the beauty industry of the 1950s. It wasn't just selling products, it was selling a solution to a problem that the industry itself had created. Think about it. How do you build a business that generates billions of dollars year after year? You don't just sell a product that solves a problem once and for all. No. You create a need that can never be fully satisfied. You convince people they have a problem, sell them a temporary solution, and then convince them the problem still exists, so they need to buy more. It's brilliant, it's profitable, and it's exactly what happened to women in the 1950s. Let me take you inside the boardrooms and advertising agencies where this strategy was being perfected. The 1950s saw an explosion in consumer culture like America had never experienced before. The economy was booming. People had disposable income. Television was becoming a fixture in American homes, and advertisers realized they had found something extraordinary. A captive audience of millions of housewives sitting at home during the day with nothing to do but watch television and read magazines. These women had purchasing power. They made the household buying decisions. They were the key to massive profits, and the beauty industry was about to figure out how to unlock that potential. Two companies led the charge, and their names probably sound familiar: Revlon and Hazel Bishop. These weren't small operations. These were giants that understood the power of the new medium of television. They invested millions, literally ions of dollars in television sponsorship. They didn't just buy commercial slots during shows. They sponsored entire programs. Revlon had the $64,000 Question, one of the most popular game shows of the era. Hazel Bishop sponsored various programs throughout the week. When you watch these shows, you weren't just seeing occasional commercials. The entire program was brought to you by these beauty companies. Their names were woven into the fabric of the entertainment itself. But here's where it gets really interesting. The advertising wasn't just about showing you a product and telling you to buy it. That's too simple, too obvious. No, the real genius was in creating an emotional need, a psychological vulnerability. And Betty Friedan, who we've talked about before, she understood this perfectly. In her book, The Feminine Mystique, she wrote something that still gives me chills. She said that somehow, somewhere, people figured out that women would buy more things if they were kept in a self-hating, ever-failing, hungry, and sexually insecure state of being. Read that again. Self-hating, ever-failing, hungry, sexually insecure. Those weren't accidental side effects of the beauty industry. They were the business model. Let me show you how this worked in practice. Pick up any women's magazine from the 1950s. Let's say it's a 1956 edition of Ladies' Home Journal. You open it, and what do you see? Beautiful photographs of beautiful women with perfect skin, perfect hair, perfect figures. They're wearing lovely clothes in spotless homes. They're smiling, relaxed, confident. The caption might say something like, "The secret to her happiness? She uses Pond's cold cream every night," or "Notice how her husband can't take his eyes off her. That's because she knows the power of Revlon's new lipstick shade." Now, you're a housewife reading this magazine. Maybe you're sitting in your key during a rare quiet moment. You look at these images, you read these captions, and almost unconsciously you start making comparisons. Your skin doesn't look that smooth. Your hair doesn't shine like that. Your figure isn't quite that perfect. And your husband, well, he certainly doesn't look at you the way that magazine husband looks at his wife. So, what's the conclusion you draw? Something must be wrong with you. You must be doing something wrong. You're failing at being a proper woman. But wait, there's hope. The magazine suggests that if you just buy these products, if you follow this routine, if you use this brand instead of the one you're currently using, you too can achieve this happiness, this beauty, this desirable life. Do you see how insidious that is? The magazine has just made you feel inadequate, then immediately offered you a solution. But here's the trick. The solution doesn't actually work, not in the way they promise. Using Pond's cold cream won't make your husband look at you like a lovesick teenager. Buying Revlon lipstick won't transform your life. But the ads don't promise specific, measurable results. They promise feelings, confidence, attractiveness, love, happiness. And feelings are subjective. You can never quite achieve them fully. There's always room for doubt. Maybe you need a different shade. Maybe you need to use more products. Maybe you're still doing something wrong. And this brings us to a crucial point about who was creating these messages. The editorial decisions at women's magazines in the 1950s were made almost exclusively by men. Male editors, male publishers, male advertising executives. These were the people deciding what women should read, what they should value, what they should aspire to. And their vision of womanhood was incredibly narrow. Betty Friedan observed that these magazines presented women with only two ions: the happy housewife or the unhappy career woman. There was no middle ground, no woman who was both employed and fulfilled, no housewife who expressed ambition beyond her home. The message was consistent and relentless. A woman's fulfillment came from one place only: the domestic sphere, her husband, her children, her home, and her appearance. Because that's what made her valuable in that sphere. Let me share a fascinating detail about how this worked. Magazine articles were technically written by journalists, not advertisers. This meant they didn't have to follow the same truth in advertising regulations that commercials did. An Advertisement had to be somewhat honest about what a product could do, but an article could make all kinds of suggestions and implications without being held to the same standard. So you would have articles with titles like How to Keep Your Husband Happy or The Secret to Being an Attractive Wife. And these articles would be filled with product recommendations. They would mention specific brands, specific items, specific routines. But because it was presented as editorial content, as advice from one woman to another, it felt more trustworthy than a straightforward ad. It was advertising disguised as helpful information. Television took this to another level entirely. For the first time in history, advertisers could reach into people's homes with moving images and sound. They could show you not just a product, but a story, a scene, a moment of life that you could imagine yourself in. And they focused intensely on daytime programming because that's when housewives were watching. Soap operas, cooking shows, game shows, all of these were sponsored by beauty companies and household product manufacturers. The commercials were frequent and persuasive. I want you to imagine you're watching television one afternoon in 1957, a commercia. Elle comes on for a new hair, color product. The commercial shows a woman looking sad and tired. Her hair is dull. Her husband barely notices her when he comes home from work, but then she discovers this new hair color. The next scene shows her with gorgeous, shining hair. Her husband walks in, does a double take, and sweeps her into his arms. The voiceover says something like, "See the difference beautiful hair makes. He'll fall in love with you all over again. Try Clairol today." The commercial ends with the couple embracing while the woman smiles at the camera as if to say, "This could be you." Now, that commercial just told you several things. First, if your husband isn't romantically interested in you, it's because of how you look. Second, changing your hair color can save your marriage. Third, you need this product to be loved. None of these things are true, obviously, but when you're a housewife who feels isolated, who's experiencing the unnamed problem Betty Friedan described, who wonders why your life feels empty despite having everything you're supposed to want, well, maybe a part of you thinks, what if it really is that simple? What if I just need better hair? It's cheaper than therapy, right? Less scary than admitting you're deeply unhappy. So you buy the product, you try it, and maybe for a few days you feel better. You feel like you're doing something to improve your situation, but of course it doesn't actually solve the real problems. So the emptiness returns, and next week there's another commercial suggesting another product that will solve another aspect of your supposed inadequacy. The beauty industry had created a perpetual cycle. You feel inadequate, you buy a product, you feel briefly better, the inadequacy returns, you buy another product. And on it goes. The industry even had a term for this kind of product. They called them redemptive purchases. Purchases that promise to redeem you, to fix you, to transform you from your flawed current self into a better, more acceptable version. The language itself is revealing. Redemption implies sin, implies something wrong that needs to be corrected. And what was the sin? Simply being a woman with a normal, natural body and face. Let me tell you about one particular advertising campaign that really exemplifies this approach. In the mid-1950s, there was an ad for a product called Lysol. Now, you might know Lysol as a household cleaner, but in the 1950s, it was also marketed to women as a feminine hygiene product. I'm being delicate here, but basically, women were told they needed to use this disinfectant as an intimate wash. The ads were remarkable in their manipulation. They showed subtle-looking women with captions like, "Why doesn't he love me anymore?" The ad would go on to suggest very strongly that the reason your husband wasn't romantically interested was because you weren't fresh enough, clean enough, pleasant enough, and the solution, Lysol. The ads actually said that Lysol would help you maintain your husband's love and interest. This is shocking on multiple levels. First, it's telling women that their natural bodies are dirty and unacceptable. Second, it's placing the responsibility for a marriage's intimacy entirely on the woman. Third, and this is really important, Lysol was dangerous to use in this way. It could cause irritation, burns, and serious health problems. But the company didn't care. They saw a market, a fear they could exploit, and they went after it. And women, desperate to save their marriages, to be good wives, to fix whatever was wrong with them, they bought it, they used it, and they suffered the consequences in silence, because who could they tell? How could you admit to your doctor that you were using household disinfectant as a perso? Now hygiene product because an ad suggested it would make your husband love you. Now let's talk about the economics of all this. The beauty industry in the 1950s was generating enormous amounts of money. We're talking about billions of dollars in today's currency. The average housewife was spending a significant portion of the household budget on beauty and grooming products. Conservative estimates suggest that a middle-class family in the 1950s might spend 5 to 10% of their discretionary income on these items. That might not sound like much, but remember, this was in addition to all the other household expenses, and for some women, especially those who were particularly anxious about their appearance or whose husbands demanded perfection, the spending could be much higher. Department stores dedicated entire floors to cosmetics and beauty products. Drugstores had huge sections for these items. New stores were opening that specialized only in beauty supplies. The 1950s saw the birth of what we now call the beauty retail industry, and it was thriving. Every new product that came out was presented as revolutionary, as life-changing, even though realistically, how different could one red lipstick be from another? But the marketing convinced women that there were significant differences, that choosing the right shade, the right brand, could make or break your appearance. Here's something that really illustrates the power of this marketing in the 1950 seconds. Chemical hair relaxers became widely available for black women. These were harsh chemicals that could straighten naturally curly or kinky hair, and they were marketed aggressively. The message was clear. Straight hair, European-looking hair was professional, acceptable, beautiful. Natural black hair was not. This was incredibly damaging both physically and psychologically. The chemicals could cause burns, hair loss, and scalp damage. But the psychological damage was perhaps even worse. The message that your natural hair, your natural appearance was unacceptable. That cuts deep. And it was all in service of selling products. The beauty industry didn't care about black women's well-being. They cared about creating a market, creating insecurity, and then profiting from it. The same thing happened with other beauty standards we haven't fully discussed yet. Skin. Lightening creams were marketed heavily to women of color with the promise that lighter skin would make them more attractive, more acceptable, more successful. These products often contained harmful ingredients like mercury or hydroquinone in dangerous concentrations, but again, the industry prioritized profits over safety. They identified insecurities, many of which they had helped create through years of promoting European beauty standards, and then sold expensive, sometimes dangerous solutions. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt pressured to buy a product you didn't really need because the advertising made you feel like you were missing out, like everyone else had figured out this secret and you were behind? That feeling that's not accidental, it's carefully crafted. The 1950s beauty industry perfected the art of FOMO, fear of missing out, decades before we had a term for it. Their ads would show groups of women, all beautiful and put together, often with one woman looking slightly less polished. The implication was clear. Don't be that woman. Don't be the one who gets left behind. Buy this product. Join the club of women who know the secret. Television shows reinforce these messages constantly. But here's what's interesting. The television shows themselves were also presenting a very specific vision of womanhood. Think about the popular shows of the era. Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver, The Donna Reed Show, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. In every single one of these shows, the mother character is perfectly dressed, perfectly coiffed, always wearing makeup, and jewelry, even at home in the middle of the day. She never looks tired or stressed. Her house is always immaculate. She's always patient and cheerful, and she seems to do all of this effortlessly. These shows were sponsored by beauty and household product companies, so the shows themselves became extended advertisements. Women watching at home would see June Clever vacuuming in a dress and pearls, looking fresh and lovely, and they would think, that's what I should look like. I should be able to maintain that standard. And if I can't, maybe I need better products. Maybe I need to try harder. Maybe something is wrong with me. The shows never acknowledged the artifice involved. They never showed the actress getting into her costume and makeup. They never showed the set being cleaned and prepared. They presented this fantasy as reality, and women judged themselves against it, and the magazines kept pushing the message that any woman could achieve this with enough dedication. They ran articles with titles like How She Does It All, Housewife, Mother, and Beauty Queen. These articles would profile women who supposedly maintained perfect homes, perfect children, perfect appearances, and perfect marriages. They made it sound easy, just a matter of organization and choosing the right products. What they never mentioned was that many of these featured women had help, cleaning ladies, nannies, family, support, or that the perfect life described in the article was often exaggerated or entirely fictional, created for the article. The beauty industry also got very good at creating product cycles, convincing women they needed to constantly update and replace their beauty products. Spring lines, summer colors, fall trends, winter essential. The message was that last season's lipstick shade was now outdated. You needed the new one to stay current, to be fashionable, to be acceptable. This created a built-in obsolescence for products that didn't actually wear out. Your lipstick from last year still works just fine, but if you use it, you're behind the times. You're not keeping up. You're failing at being a proper fashionable woman. And let's not forget about the role of Hollywood in all of this. Movie studios in the 1950s had agreements with cosmetics companies. When you saw a star, like Elizabeth Taylor or Grace Kelly on screen wearing a particular shade of lipstick, there was often a corresponding product you could buy. Wear the same shade as your favorite star, the ads would proclaim. This created a direct link between Hollywood glamour and products available at your local drugstore. For the price of a lipstick, you could feel like a movie star. Or so they promised. Of course, you would never actually look like Elizabeth Taylor just from buying her lipstick. But the fantasy was compelling. Enough to drive sales. The beauty industry's golden age in the 1950s set patterns that persist to this day. The basic psychological tactics haven't changed much. Create insecurity, offer a solution, make sure the solution is temporary so they keep buying. Use beautiful, unattainable images as the standard. Imply that purchasing products will bring love, happiness, and success. These strategies worked brilliantly then, and they continue to work now, just with updated products and delivery methods. Instagram influencers are doing essentially what magazine ads did in the 1950s. The technology has changed, but the psychology hasn't. So we've seen how the industry operated, how it created demand, how it kept women trapped in cycles of purchasing and inadequacy. But all of this, all the marketing and manipulation, it was built on a foundation of something much darker. Because when women couldn't achieve the impossible standards despite buying all the products and following all the advice, when the emptiness persisted, no matter how much money they spent or how much effort they put in, the industry had another solution to offer. Not a beauty product this time, but a medical one. Pills, tranquilizers, drugs that would numb the pain and quiet the questions. And that pharmaceutical solution, that chemical approach to the problem that had no name, that's where things got truly dangerous. That's the next piece of this puzzle we need to examine, because the beauty industry sold the dream. But when the dream turned into a nightmare, the pharmaceutical industry was waiting with their own products to sell. Imagine walking into your doctor's office in 1956. You're a housewife, maybe 35 years old. You tell the doctor you've been feeling anxious, having trouble sleeping, experiencing what you describe as a tired feeling. You get angry with your children and it scares you. You feel like crying for no reason. The doctor listens for maybe 5 minutes. Then he reaches for his prescription pad. He doesn't ask about your life, your marriage, your isolation in the suburbs, the dreams you gave up. He doesn't suggest therapy or lifestyle changes. Instead, he writes down a single word, Milltown. He tears off the prescription, hands it to you with a smile, and says, "This will help you feel better. Take one in the morning, one in the afternoon if you need it. You'll be fine." And just like that, you've joined millions of American women in what would become one of the largest pharmaceutical experiments in history. An experiment conducted without informed consent, without proper understanding of the consequences, and driven entirely by profit. Let me tell you about Milltown. The drug's generic name was Mepramate, but Arion knew it by its brand name, Milltown, after the town in New Jersey where it was manufactured. It was developed in the early 1950s by a man named Frank Berger. He wasn't even looking for a tranquilizer initially. He was working on a preservative for penicillin when he noticed that one compound had an interesting effect on laboratory animals. It calmed them without completely sedating them. The animals could still function, still move around, but they seemed relaxed, less anxious. Berger saw potential. He refined the compound, tested it further, and by 1955, Milltown was launched on the American market. What happened next was extraordinary. Milltown became the first blockbuster drug in American pharmaceutical history. And when I say blockbuster, I mean it absolutely exploded. By 1956, just 1 year after its launch, 1 in 20 Americans had tried Milltown. 1 in 20. That's millions of people. By 1957, Americans had filled 36 million prescriptions for this drug. The manufacturer had produced more than 1 billion pills. 1 billion. And here's the kicker. Milltown prescriptions accounted for 1/3 of all prescriptions written in America. 1/3 for a single drug that had only existed for 2 years. But who was taking all these pills? You can probably guess. Women, housewives specifically. By 1960, studies show that women were taking tranquilizers like Milltown at twice the rate of men, twice as many. And the pharmaceutical companies, the doctors, the media, they all acted like this was perfectly normal, even desirable. The drug was marketed as something that would help women cope with the stresses of daily life, help them be better wives, better mothers, better housewives. Now, here's something fascinating about how Milltown became so popular. It had virtually zero advertising to consumers in the beginning. This was before the era of direct-to-consumer drug advertising, pharmaceutical. Companies couldn't advertise prescription drugs on television or in general interest magazines. So, how did Milltown become a household name? Through something even more powerful than advertising, celebrity, endorsement, and word of mouth. Hollywood celebrities started talking about Milltown openly, enthusiastically. Milton Berle, one of the biggest television stars of the era, took Milltown regularly, and he didn't keep it secret. He joked about it on his show. He called himself Uncle Milltown. He made it seem cool, sophisticated, part of modern living. Other celebrities followed suit. Taking Milltown became almost fashionable in certain circles. It was the peace pill, the happy pill, the drug that sophisticated people use to manage the pressures of modern life. And when regular housewives heard these glamorous celebrities talking about Milltown, they thought, well, if it's good enough for Milton Berle, maybe it could help me too. They went to their doctors and specifically asked for Milltown by name. And doctors, seeing this as a miracle solution to the vague complaints they were hearing from female patients, prescribed it freely. Let me introduce you to a woman named Ruth. Her story was documented in a medical case study from the early 1960s, though her name was changed for privacy. Ruth was 32 years old, married with 3 children under the age of 10. She went to her doctor in 1956 complaining of anxiety and difficulty sleeping. Her Doctor prescribed Milltown, 1 pill in the morning, 1 at night. Ruth took the medication as directed, and at first it seemed to help. She felt calmer. The edge of anxiety that had been constant was dulled. She could get through her daily tasks without that underlying sense of panic. But here's what Ruth didn't know. Milltown was habit-forming. Your body developed a tolerance to it, meaning you needed increasingly higher doses to get the SAM. Effect. And if you tried to stop taking it, you experienced withdrawal symptoms, serious withdrawal symptoms. Ruth found this out the hard way. After taking Milltown for about 6 months, she decided she didn't need it anymore. She felt better, more stable, so she just stopped taking it. Within 2 days, she was experiencing anxiety worse than before she started the medication. She felt nauseous, shaky. She couldn't sleep. She was irritable and on edge. Frightened by these symptoms, she started taking the pills again. The symptoms went away, and Ruth realized, with growing horror, that she was dependent on this medication. Over the next several years, Ruth's dosage gradually increased. She started with 2 pills a day, then 3, then 4. By 1960, she was taking 6 pills daily just to feel normal. And she wasn't alone. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands of women found themselves in similar situations. They'd gone to their doctors seeking help for legitimate distress. They had been given a pill that provided temporary relief, but that pill came with a price, dependence. And once you were dependent, stopping was incredibly difficult. The withdrawal symptoms from Milltown were no joke. Medical literature from the era documents cases of women experiencing anxiety, confusion, convulsions, hallucinations, impaired coordination, insomnia, loss of appetite, muscle twitching, slurred speech, tremors, vertigo, and severe vomiting when they tried to stop taking the drug. Some women had to be hospitalized to safely withdraw from Milltown. Can you imagine? You went to your doctor with mild anxiety. He gave you a pill, and within months you were physically addicted to a substance that caused convulsions and hallucinations. If you tried to quit. But Milltown was just the beginning. It opened the floodgates for a whole category of drugs called minor tranquilizers. After Milltown came Librium in 1960, then Valium in 1963. These drugs were from a different chemical class, benzodiazepines, and they were even more potent than Milltown. Valium in particular became enormous. By the 1970s, it was the most prescribed drug in America. And again, the primary users were women, housewives. The advertising to doctors, because that's who pharmaceutical companies marketed to, was explicitly gendered. The ad showed stressed, anxious women whose problems could be solved with these medications. One particularly disturbing ad from the 1960s showed a woman standing in the middle of a messy house surrounded by children looking overwhelmed. The headline read something like, "You can't set her free, but you can help her feel less anxious about it." The implication was clear. Women were trapped in situations that made them miserable. But instead of changing those situations, doctors should just drug them into acceptance, and doctors did in huge numbers. But it wasn't just tranquilizers. Housewives in the 1950s and 60s were also being prescribed amphetamines. Now you might wonder, why would doctors give housewives speed? The answer is weight loss. Remember those impossible beauty standards we discussed? The tiny waists, the perfect figures. Many women struggled to maintain those standards through diet alone. So doctors prescribed amphetamines as diet pills. These were powerful stimulants that suppressed appetite and increased energy. Brand names like Dexedrine and Benzedrine were commonly prescribed. And here's where it gets really wild. Some doctors prescribed a combination drug called Dexame. This was literally an amphetamine and a barbiturate sedative combined in one pill. The amphetamine would give you energy and suppress your appetite during the day. The barbiturate would help you sleep at night. It was uppers and downers in one convenient package. The logic, if you can call it, teach, at was that women could use amphetamines to have the energy to do all their housework and stay thin, and then use barbiturates or tranquilizers to calm down and sleep at night. They were being medicated to function in a role that was making them sick. Rather than anyone questioning whether the role itself was the problem, let me share another woman's story. This comes from testimony given years later. Her name was Linda, and in 1957 she was a young mother of two living in a suburb outside of Chicago. She was exhausted all the time. The housework was endless. The children needed constant attention. Her husband expected a clean home and hot meals. She felt overwhelmed and inadequate. She mentioned this to her doctor during a routine checkup. He prescribed her Dexedrine for energy and Miltown for anxiety. Linda took these medications as directed. The Dexedrine did give her energy. She could clean her house with intensity, organize closets, cook elaborate meals, but the Dexedrine also made her jittery and anxious, which is why the doctor had also prescribed the Miltown to counteract those side effects. Linda lived like this for 3 years, amphetamines during the day, tranquilizers to smooth out the rough edges and help her sleep. She lost weight, which everyone complimented her on. She kept an immaculate house, which her husband appreciated, but she felt like she was vibrating on a different frequency than the rest of the world. She was functioning but barely, and she was completely dependent on these medications. When she finally tried to stop with medical supervision this time, the withdrawal process took months. She had to slowly taper off both drugs while dealing with exhaustion, depression, anxiety, and a host of physical symptoms. And even after she was off the medication, she struggled with the psychological aftermath of years of being chemically manipulated. Now you may be wondering, didn't doctors know these drugs were addictive? Didn't they understand the risks? The answer is complicated. Some doctors genuinely believed these medications were safe. The pharmaceutical companies assured them that the risk of dependence was minimal when taken as prescribed. And remember, these were new drugs. The long-term effects weren't fully understood yet. But also, let's be honest, many doctors didn't take women's health concerns seriously. When women came in with vague complaints of anxiety, fatigue, or unhappiness, many doctors saw this as neurotic, as women being overly emotional. Prescribing a pill was quick, easy, and got the patient out of the office. Whether it actually helped the underlying problem didn't seem to matter much. And the pharmaceutical companies, they knew exactly what they were doing. Internal documents that came to light years later showed that these companies were aware of the addiction potential. They were aware of the serious withdrawal symptoms, but they downplayed these risks in their marketing to doctors. They emphasized the benefits and minimized the dangers because these drugs were incredibly profitable. Miltown alone generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. Valium eventually became a billion-dollar drug. The pharmaceutical industry had no incentive to limit prescriptions or warn more strongly about risks. They had every incentive to keep doctors prescribing and women refilling their prescriptions month after month, year after year. The marketing to doctors was sophisticated and relentless. Pharmaceutical representatives called detail men would visit doctors' offices regularly. They would bring samples, promotional materials, and research studies carefully selected to show the drugs in the best light. They would take doctors out to lunch, sponsor medical conferences, provide gifts. This was all legal and considered normal practice. And it worked. Doctors prescribed what was being promoted to them. And what was being heavily promoted was tranquilizers and diet pills for housewives. There were even ads in medical journals specifically targeting the housewife market. One ad I came across showed a picture of a housewife looking distressed with text that described her as suffering from housewife syndrome. The solution offered their tranquilizer. Another ad showed a woman whose husband was clearly frustrated with her, with copy suggesting that the woman's anxiety was causing marital problems that could be solved with medication. The subtext was always the same. Women's psychological distress is an individual medical problem to be managed with drugs, not a social problem requiring systemic change. And let's talk about what these drugs were prescribed for. The indications were incredibly broad. Anxiety, obviously, but also tension, nervousness, insomnia, what doctors called emotional upsets, and even things like premenstrual syndrome or menopausal symptoms. Basically, any time a woman expressed any negative emotional discomfort, there was a pill for it. One ad for Milltown actually suggested it would make pregnancy a happier experience. Pregnancy, a normal, natural biological process, and they were suggesting women needed to be medicated through it. And we now know that Milltown is dangerous during pregnancy, potentially causing birth defects. It passes through breast milk and can affect nursing babies. But pregnant women and nursing mothers were prescribed this drug because pharmaceutical companies prioritize sales over safety. Here's something that really illustrates the scale of this problem. A 1964 FDA Consumer Magazine article described what they called the tranquilized housewife. The article painted a picture: the smartly dressed woman driving a sleek, late-model car company. Old be the envy of her neighbors. She has a loving husband, bright children, a beautiful home in the suburbs, and apparently no care in the world. But then the article revealed that this apparently perfect woman was dependent on tranquilizers to get through each day. She seemed to have everything, but she was medicating herself just to cope with having everything. The article estimated that millions of American women fit this description, and culturally this became normalized. Taking tranquilizers as a housewife became so common that it entered the popular consciousness. The Rolling Stones wrote a song in 1966 called Mother's Little Helper, explicitly about housewives using pills to cope. The lyrics talked about how the pills helped women get through their busy days, helped them deal with their boring lives. It was presented with some sympathy, but also with a kind of resigned acceptance that this is just what housewives did. They took pills. It was expected, almost required. But here's what makes me angry about all this. These women were suffering from real problems: the isolation of suburban life, the lack of intellectual stimulation, the loss of identity and autonomy, the pressure to maintain impossible standards, the restriction of their potential and ambitions. These were societal problems, structural problems. But instead of addressing those problems, instead of questioning why so many housewives were miserable despite having everything they were told they should want, the solution was to drug them, keep them functioning in their roles, keep them quiet, keep them from asking too many questions or demanding too much change. Betty Friedan understood this perfectly. She wrote about the tranquilized housewife extensively. She argued that prescribing pills for the problem that has no name was treating the symptom while ignoring the disease. The disease was the feminine mystique itself, the narrow, confining role that women were forced into. The pills didn't cure anything. They just made the pain bearable enough that women could continue in roles that were fundamentally unfulfilling and psychologically damaging. And the tragedy is that these medications, which were prescribed to help women feel better, often made things worse in the long run. Physical dependence, psychological dependence. The drugs interfered with women's ability to accurately assess their situations. When you're medicated, you might not realize how unhappy you truly are. You might not recognize that your life circumstances need to change. The pills created a fog that made it harder to see clearly, to think clearly, to act on your own behalf. They were, in a very real sense, tools of oppression, disguised as medical treatment. Let me share one more detail that really brings this home. There was a 1957 study. I believe it was published in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, where doctors described who needed these tranquilizers most. They said anxiety was statistically normal among professional persons, but rare among what they called Southern Negroes and reservation Indians. In other words, they explicitly said that anxiety was a disease of educated middle class, primarily white people, the brain workers and their wives. This reveals so much about how they viewed the problem. It wasn't that middle-class white housewives had legitimate reasons to be anxious or unhappy. It was that they were constitutionally prone to anxiety because of their class and race. It's racist, it's classist, and it completely misses the point. But all of these pills, all of this medication, all of this chemical intervention, it was still just treating symptoms. Because underneath all the makeup, all the girdles, all the beauty treatments, all the tranquilizers, there was still a human being, a woman with thoughts, feelings, dreams, and potential, a woman who was slowly disappearing under the weight of everyone's expectations. And some of these women, despite all the pressure, despite all the medication, despite all the cultural forces telling them to be quiet and grateful, they started to wake up. They started to name the problem. They started to speak out. That resistance, that awakening, that's where hope begins. And that's where we're going next. Because for every woman who stayed silent, there were a few who found their voice. And those voices, small at first, but growing, louder, would eventually spark a revolution. Stay with me, because this is where the story starts to shift. This is where we meet the women who refused to take the pills, refused to wear the masks, refused to stay quiet, the rebels who would light the way forward. Not everyone wore the mask perfectly. Not every woman swallowed the pills without question, and some women, even in the darkest days of the 1950s conformity, found ways to resist, to question, to refuse. They were rare, these rebels. They were often criticized, ostracized, called selfish or crazy or bad mothers. But they existed, and their stories, though harder to find in the historical record, are perhaps the most important stories of all, because they show us that, even in the most oppressive circumstances, resistance is possible, change is possible, freedom is possible. Let me start by telling you about someone who became a symbol of this resistance, though she didn't set out to be one. Her name was Betty Friedan. And yes, we've mentioned her before, but what's fascinating is her own story, her own journey to becoming the voice of the housewife's rebellion. Because Betty wasn't born a feminist activist, she was a housewife herself, or at least that's how she presented herself. She lived in the suburbs with her hoe band and 3 children. She appeared on the surface to be living the exact life that women of her generation were supposed to want. But Betty had a secret. She'd been a labor journalist in the 1940s. She'd been involved in radical leftist politics. She had an intellect and ambition that couldn't be contained by the role of housewife. But here's the interesting thing. When Betty wrote The Feminine Mystique, when she conducted all those interviews and compiled all that research, she presented herself as just another suburban housewife who had stumbled onto this problem. She downplayed her political background, her journalism experience, her radical history. Why? Because she knew that if she came across as a political activist, as someone from outside the mainstream, her message would be dismissed. Women wouldn't listen to a radical, but they might listen to someone who seemed like one of them, someone who had discovered these truths from within the suburban bubble. It was, as one historian later called it, a necessary fiction. Betty had to hide parts of herself to be heard. Even in her rebellion, she had to perform a certain version of femininity to be taken seriously, and that tells you something important about how hard it was to resist in the 1950s. You couldn't just openly rebel. You had to be strategic. You had to find ways to question the system from within. And many women did this in small, quiet ways that never made the history books, but were acts of resistance nonetheless. Let me tell you about a woman named Gloria. I found her story in a collection of oral histories from women who lived through this era. Gloria was married in 1952, had her first child in 1953, and from the beginning she felt something was wrong. Not with her marriage or her child exactly, but with her life. She had graduated from college, top of her class in English literature. She had wanted to be a writer, but after marriage, that dream was put aside. She was supposed to find fulfillment in homemaking, except she didn't. She found it mind-numbingly boring. So Gloria did something radical, at least for her time and place. She kept writing in secret. After her husband left for work and her child went down for a nap, Gloria would sit at her kitchen table and write short stories, mostly essays, observations about the world around her. She never showed this writing to anyone. She certainly didn't try to publish it. That would have been too openly rebellious, too threatening to her role as a wife and mother. But the act of writing, of maintaining this intellectual life in secret, that was her form of resistance. It was how she held on to herself, her identity, her sense that she was more than just someone's wife or mother. When I read Gloria's testimony decades after the fact, she said something that really stuck with me. She said, "I realize now that I was hiding my own mind from my family. I was living a double life. During the day, I played the role of the perfect housewife, but in those stolen hours, I was myself. I was a thinker, a writer, a person with ideas and ambitions, and I had to keep that person hidden because revealing her would have threatened everything." Can you imagine living like that? Having to hide your intelligence, your creativity, your very self, because expressing it would make you unacceptable. But many women did exactly this. They found small ways to maintain their sense of self in a world that wanted them to disappear into their roles. Some women continued working despite the social pressure to quit. These women faced enormous criticism. They were called bad mothers. People suggested their children would suffer, that their marriages would fail, but they persisted. I came across the story of a woman named Elena, who was a school teacher in the 1950s. She had 2 children and continued teaching throughout their childhood. Her mother-in-law never forgave her for this. Literally, Elena said that her mother-in-law, until the day she died, would make comments about how Elena's children were being neglected, how they needed their mother at home. Never mind that Elena's children grew up healthy and happy. Never mind that Elena loved teaching and was good at it. She had violated the cardinal rule, a mother's place is in the home. But Elena kept teaching. Every day she faced judgment and criticism. Every parent-teacher conference, every school event. She knew people were looking at her and thinking working mother said, with a kind of disdain, a suggestion that she was selfish, that she cared more about her career than her children. But she endured it because teaching gave her life meaning beyond the domestic sphere. It kept her intellectually engaged. It provided income that gave her some financial independence. And that independence that was precious, because women who depended entirely on their husband's income were completely economically vulnerable. If the marriage failed, if the husband died, they had nothing. Elena understood this. So she kept working, kept facing the criticism, kept standing firm. Then there were women who openly questioned the beauty standards, though they paid a social price for it. I found a fascinating account of a woman named Marie who in 1957 decided she was done with foundation garments. She was 38 years old, and she'd been wearing girdles and corsets since she was 17, more than 20 years of daily discomfort, and one morning she just said, "No more." She put on a dress without a girdle underneath. Her natural figure was visible under her clothing. Her waist wasn't cinched. Her body moved naturally. Her husband was horrified. He told her she couldn't go out looking like that. She looked improper, sloppy. What would people think? But Marie stood her ground. She said, and I'm paraphrasing from her testimony, I told him that my body was my own, that I was done hurting myself to meet some arbitrary standard of what women should look like. He threatened to divorce me. Can you imagine threatening divorce over an undergarment? But I didn't back down. And you know what? After a few weeks he got used to it, and I realized that most of the pressure I'd been feeling wasn't even from him. It was from society, from other women, from this unspoken expectation that we all had to suffer in the same ways. Marie's act of rebellion was her own body, refusing to shape it restrict it, hide it. And while it might seem like a small thing, in the context of the 1950s, it was radical because the female body was supposed to be controlled, contained, perfected. A woman who let her body exist in its natural state was rebelling against fundamental assumptions about femininity. Now, there were also women who have been questioning these systems long before the 1950s. Women whose voices had been marginalized or ignored. Women journalists and writers who had been pointing out the problems with women's roles for years, but their work was often dismissed as the complaints of unhappy career women, women who were supposedly bitter because they had rejected their natural feminine roles. One of the cruelest aspects of the feminine mystique was how it discredited any woman who criticized it. If you were a housewife who was unhappy, you were told you had a personal problem, something wrong with you individually. But if you were a career woman who criticized the housewife role, you were told you were just jealous, bitter, unfulfilled as a woman. Either way, your criticism was invalidated. It was a perfect trap. But some women found ways to be heard despite this. There were small publications, alternative magazines, women's groups that met quietly to discuss these issues. The groundwork for what would become second wave feminism was being laid by these women throughout the 1950s. They were planting seeds that would eventually grow into a movement. Betty Friedan didn't create feminism out of nothing. She synthesized and amplified voices that had been speaking, often in whispers, for years. And then there's the story of women who simply refused the tranquilizers. Remember earlier when we talked about those medications? Well, not every woman took them. Some women, when their doctors offered them pills, said no. One woman I read about, named Judith, was offered Milltown by her doctor in 1958. She had gone in complaining of anxiety and sleeplessness. The doctor immediately reached for his prescription pad. But Judith stopped him. She said, "I don't want pills. I want to understand why I'm feeling this way." The doctor was taken aback. He explained that the pills would make her feel better. She insisted, "But what's making me feel bad in the first place? Shouldn't we talk about that?" The doctor, to his credit, actually listened. They talked for another 20 minutes. He asked about her life, her daily routine, her sense of purpose, and by the end of the conversation, he had to admit that her unhappiness seemed like a reasonable response to her circumstances, not a medical problem requiring medication. He couldn't offer her a solution because the solution would have required changing society, not just treating her symptoms. But Judith left that office without a prescription, and she felt validated. Someone had acknowledged that her feelings made sense. Judith's act of refusal was small but significant. She insisted on being seen as a rational person with legitimate concerns, not just a neurotic woman needing to be medicated, and by refusing the pills, she refused to have her consciousness dulled, her questions quieted. She stayed uncomfortable, yes, but she also stayed aware, and that awa, Renesse, eventually led her to seek out other women who felt the same way, to find community and support outside the medical establishment. Have you ever refused something that everyone expected you to accept? Stood your ground when it would have been easier to go along? That's what these women were doing in big ways and small ways. They were saying, "No, I won't accept this. I won't pretend. I won't perform. I won't medicate myself into compliance." And each act of refusal, each small rebellion weakened the system just a little bit. There were also women who continued their education despite enormous obstacles. Some went to night school while raising children. Some took correspondence courses. Some simply read voraciously, educating themselves independently. I found the story of a woman named Diane, who in the mid-1950s, while raising 3 young children, taught herself advanced mathematics by working through textbooks she borrowed from the library. Her husband thought she was wasting her time. What did a housewife need with mathematics? But Diane loved it. The intellectual challenge kept her mind sharp. It reminded her that she was capable of complex thought, that she had potential beyond cooking and cleaning. Years later, after her children were in school, Diane got a job as a computer programmer, one of the early women in that field. The mathematics she had taught herself made it possible, her act of self-education in the 1950s when it seemed pointless, when no one supported it, that laid the groundwork for her later career and independence. She had kept her mind alive during years when society wanted it dormant. And we need to talk about the women of color who were navigating an even more complex set of expectations and restrictions. Black women, Latina women, Asian American women, they faced not just the gender constraints of the 1950s, but also racial discriminatio. Many black women were working, not by choice, but by economic necessity. They didn't have the option of being full-time housewives, even if they wanted to be. They were working as domestic servants in white women's homes, caring for white women's children while their own children were at home, or being cared for by relatives. These women were resisting the feminine mystique simply by existing outside its boundaries. They weren't in the suburbs. They weren't buying the products. They weren't measuring themselves against the beauty standards that explicitly excluded them. And many of them were involved in civil rights activism, in church groups, in community organizing. They were creating networks of mutual support and resistance that would be crucial to both the civil rights movement and later feminist movements. Their stories are often left out of histories of the 1950s, but they're essential because they show us that the feminine mystique was never universal. It was a white middle-class phenomenon, and women who existed outside those categories were already living alternative models of womanhood. There's a woman named Ella Baker who's worth mentioning here. She was a black civil rights activist who was doing extraordinary work throughout the 1950s. She helped organize voter registration, drives, built grassroots movements, developed leadership programs. She was everything the feminine mystique said women shouldn't be. Powerful, political, ambitious, focused on work outside the home. And she faced sexism within the civil rights movement where male leaders often tried to sideline women. But she persisted. She mentored young activists. She built institutions. And she modeled a form of womanhood that had nothing to do with the suburban housewife ideal. Women like Ella Baker remind us that resistance isn't always about rejecting the dominant culture. Sometimes it's about existing in spaces where that culture never fully penetrated. Communities of color, working-class communities, they had their own values, their own models of womanhood. And while they certainly faced sexism and had their own restrictive gender roles, they weren't buying into the specific version of femininity being sold to white suburban housewives. Now, I want to be clear about something. These acts of resistance, these refusals and rebellions, they came with real costs. Women who openly defied expectations faced social ostracism. Their marriages sometimes ended. They were called bad mothers, selfish, neurotic, unfeminine. Some lost custody of their children in divorces because courts assumed that a woman who worked, or who pursued education, or who rejected traditional femininity was an unfit mother. The price of resistance was high, which is why relatively few women openly rebelled. Most women found ways to cope, to survive, to carve out small spaces of autonomy within the constraints they faced. And we can't judge them for that. Survival takes many forms. But the women who did resist, who did speak out, who did refuse, they mattered enormously because they showed that alternatives were possible. They kept alive the idea that women were full human beings with rights, capabilities, and potential. They planted seeds of doubt about the feminine mystique. They created tiny cracks in the perfect facade, and those cracks would eventually widen into fissures that would bring the whole structure down. Betty Friedan's book, when it was published in February of 1963, became an immediate bestseller. Over 1 million copies sold. And why? Because women were ready to hear the message. They had been living with unnamed pain for years. They had been questioning, doubting, suffering in silence. And suddenly, here was a book that named their experience, validated their feelings, and to tell them they weren't alone. The book gave women permission to admit they were unhappy, to acknowledge that something was fundamentally wrong with their lives. It was liberating. It was revolutionary. But the book also faced enormous backlash. Many women wrote angry letters to Fred Dan saying she was insulting housewives, devaluing their work, threatening their way of life. These women had invested everything in the role of housewife. They had sacrificed for it, suffered for it, believed in it, and Freudian was suggesting it was all a lie, all a trap. That was threatening, that was painful. Some women weren't ready to hear it. They needed to believe that their sacrifices had meaning, that their suffering had purpose. And that's understandable, isn't it? When you've spent decades of your life pursuing a particular goal, living according to particular values, it's incredibly difficult to admit that maybe those goals and values were wrong, or at least not right for you. It requires a kind of courage that not everyone has. It requires being willing to grieve for the years you've lost, the potential you've wasted. That's hard, really hard. But for the women who were ready, Freudian's book was like oxygen. It was permission to breathe, to think, to want more. It sparked conversations. Women started talking to each other, honestly, for the first time about their unhappiness, their frustrations, their sense of being trapped, and they realized they weren't alone. Millions of women felt the same way. It wasn't a personal failing, it was a systemic problem, and systemic problems require systemic solutions. Within a few years, women were organizing. The National Organization for Women was founded in 1966 with Freedom as its first president. Other feminist groups formed. Women began demanding changes: equal pay, access to education and professional, careers, reproductive rights, Child C, our support, legal protections against discrimination. The second wave of feminism was beginning, and it started because women refused to stay silent, refused to accept the role they'd been given, refused to keep pretending everything was fine. But here's something we need to understand. The resistance and the eventual feminist movement weren't just about rejecting traditional femininity or housewifery. They were about choice, about women having the right to choose their own paths, to define their own lives. Some women genuinely loved being homemakers and mothers. And that's fine. The problem was never homemaking itself. The problem was that it was the only option presented as acceptable. The problem was the pressure, the restrictions, the loss of choice and autonomy. The feminist movement fought for women to be able to choose to work or not work, choose to marry or not marry, choose to have children or not have children, choose how to dress, how to look, how to live. That's what the rebels were fighting for, freedom. So we've met these remarkable women who resisted, who questioned, who refused to accept the limits placed on them. But their individual acts of courage were just the beginning, because the truth they were all grappling with, the truth that Betty Friedan finally put into words, was that this wasn't just about beauty standards or housework or pills. It was about something much more fundamental. It was about the systematic devaluation of women's humanity, the reduction of women to decorative objects or servant roles, and understanding that, really understanding the full scope of what was being taken from women in the 1950s, that requires us to add it all up. The time spent, the money wasted, the health sacrificed, the opportunities lost. When you calculate the true cost of the perfect housewife, ideal, the numbers are staggering. And that's exactly what we need to examine next. Because only by seeing the full price can we understand why this system was so unsustainable, why it eventually had to collapse under its own weight. Let's do some math. I know math isn't exactly relaxing bedtime material, but stay with me here because these numbers tell a story that's both heartbreaking and infuriating. We need to add it all up, every hour, every dollar, every compromise, every sacrifice. Because only when you see the total cost can you truly understand what was being asked of women in the 1950s, what was being stolen from them, really, in the name of beauty and femininity. Let's start with time, because time is the resource we can never get back. We've talked about pieces of the beauty routine, but let's calculate the full picture. A typical housewife in 1955 spent approximately 2 hours every morning on her appearance, getting into her foundation garments, applying full makeup, styling her hair. 2 hours. But that's just the beginning of the day. Throughout the day there were touch-ups, reapplying lipstick after meals, which most women did religiously, checking hair, making sure nothing was out of place, changing from house, clothes into something more presentable if leaving the house or expecting visitors. Let's conservatively estimate another 30 minutes daily for these maintenance tasks. Then there were the weekly commitments, the beauty salon, visits, averaging 2 to 3 hours per week, the shopping for beauty products, and clothing, which wasn't the quick trip to the drugstore we might imagine. Department stores were the primary shopping venues, and they were experiences. You would spend time consulting with salesgirls, trying products, making selections, another 2 hours weekly easily, and the nightly routine. Removing makeup properly took time, setting hair in curlers or pin curls 30 to 45 minutes, applying night cream, AMs and beauty treatments. Another 45 minutes to an hour before bed. Let's add this up. 2 hours morning routine, 30 minutes daily maintenance, 3 hours weekly at the salon, 2 hours weekly shopping, 1 hour nightly routine. That's 3.5 hours daily on appearance alone, or about 24.5 hours weekly. That's more than a full day every single week. Over the course of a year, that's approximately 1,275 hours. Let me put that in perspective. That's 53 full days. Almost 2 full months of a woman's life every single year dedicated solely to appearance maintenance. Now, think about this. What if a woman maintained this routine from age 20 when she got married until age 60? That's 40 years. 40 years, 53 days, equals 2,120 days. That's almost 6 full years. 6 years of a woman's life from age 20 to 60 spent on beauty routines. 6 years she could never get back. 6 years that could have been spent learning, creating, building, contributing, living. But we're not done calculating yet, because there's also the housework itself, the endless domestic labor that was expected. Studies from the era suggest that housewives without modern appliances spent 40 to 60 hours per week on household chores. Cooking, cleaning, laundry by hand or with primitive machines, ironing everything, including sheets and towels, shopping for food daily because refrigerators were smaller. Even with some modern conveniences, we're talking about 30 to 40 hours weekly of domestic labor. That's a full-time job right there. Add that to the 24-plus hours on beauty, and you're looking at a 60 to 65-hour work week every week, without pay, without benefits, without vacation days or sick leave. Let me introduce you to a woman named Caroline. Her daughter interviewed her in the 1990s for a family history project, and the interview was later included in an archive. Caroline was a housewife from 1950 to 1975, 25 years her dog. Asked her a simple question. Looking back, what do you wish you had done with your time differently? Caroline thought for a long moment. Then she said something remarkable. She said, I calculated once, probably spent 3,000 hours over those years just ironing. 3,000 hours. I could have gotten a college degree with that time. I could have learned 3 languages. I could have written a dozen books. Instead, I ironed your father's shirts and your school clothes and the bed sheets that no one ever saw. I made everything perfectly smooth and pressed. And for what? What did all that ironing accomplish that mattered? 3,000 hours. Think about what you could do with 3,000 hours. You could become an expert in almost anything. You could master a musical instrument. You could start a business. You could change your life. But Caroline spent those hours ironing because that's what good housewives did. Now, let's talk about money. The financial cost of maintaining the perfect housewife image was substantial. Let's break it down. Basic foundation, garments, girdles, and bras needing replacement every 6 to 12 months due to wear probably cost a minimum of $15 to $20 annually in 1950s money. That would be about $150 to $200 in today's currency. Higher quality items, special occasion corsets, probably another $50 annually or $500 today. Cosmetics, hair, care products, skin care items. Let's conservatively estimate $30 annually or $300 today. Weekly salon visits at about $3 to $5 per visit times 52 weeks. That's $156 to $260 annually, or about $1,500 to $2,600 today. Clothing to maintain appropriate appearance, probably $100 to $200 annually in 1950s money, or $1,000 to $2,000 today. We haven't even counted shoes, accessories, jewelry, hosiery, which ran constantly and needed replacing. Let's add another $50 annually for those items, or $500 today. Total annual cost, approximately $400 in 1950 seconds money. That might not sound like much until you realize that the median household income in 1955 was about $4,000 annually. $400 represented 10% of the average household income. 10%. Imagine today if the average American household making $60,000 annually spent $6,000 just on one person's appearance, maintenance. That's the equivalent burden. And for some women, particularly, those who were anxious about their appearance or whose husbands demanded perfection, the spending was much higher. Over a lifetime, let's say 40 years of adult life maintaining these standards, $400 annually for 40 years adjusted for inflation over time. We're talking about the equivalent of over $200,000 in today's money. $200,000 spent on appearance. Think about what else that money could have bought. A house, college educations for children, retirement security, starting a business, travel, experiences, actual quality of life improvements rather than just maintaining an image. But the most devastating cost wasn't time or money. It was health. We've talked about some of the physical effects of corsets and girdles, the breathing restrictions, the digestive problems, the bruised ribs. But let's talk about the long-term consequences. Women who wore restrictive foundation garments for decades experienced permanent changes to their bodies. Rib cage deformities that persisted after they stopped wearing the garments. Weakened abdominal muscles that never fully recovered. Chronic back problems from years of unnatural posture and lack of core strength. The cosmetics of the era contained ingredients we now know are harmful. Lead in some face powders, mercury in skin lightening creams, formaldehyde in nail products. Women were essentially poisoning themselves slowly in the name of beauty. The long-term health effects of this toxic exposure are difficult to quantify, but they were real. And then there's mental health toll. The anxiety, depression, and loss of identity that so many women experienced. These weren't just temporary feelings. For many women, they became chronic conditions that persisted throughout their lives. I want to tell you about a study that was done much later in the 1980s, looking at women who had been housewives in the 1950s and 60s. The researchers were interested in long-term mental health outcomes. What they found was sobering. Women who had been full-time housewives during those decades showed significantly higher rates of depression, anxiety disorders, and what we now call PTSD, compared to women who had worked outside the home, even controlling for other factors. The experience of being a 1950s housewife had left lasting psychological scars on many women. Decades later, they were still dealing with the aftermath. Now, let's talk about opportunity cost. This is an economic term that refers to the value of what you give up when you make a particular choice. When women dedicated 60-plus hours weekly to housework and beauty maintenance, what were they giving up? Education, for one. Remember, 60% of women who attended college in the 1950s dropped out to get married. Many of those women never finished their degrees. They gave up the credential, yes, but more importantly, they gave up the knowledge, the intellectual development, the expanded opportunities that education provides. Career development was another massive opportunity cost. Women who didn't work, or who left the workforce after marriage, lost years of career progression, skill, development, salary increases, and pension contributions. Let me give you a concrete example. Imagine two women, both graduating from college in 1950. One becomes a teacher and works continuously until retirement in 1985. The other teaches for 2 years, then quits to become a full-time housewife. Fast forward to retirement. The woman who worked has a pension, has social security benefits based on her earnings, has job experience and professional connections. The housewife has nothing, zero retirement income of her own. She's entirely dependent on her husband's pension and social security. If he dies, if they divorce, she's economically devastated. That's opportunity cost. There's also the opportunity cost of personal development and fulfillment. What could these women have created, invented, discovered, contributed, if they hadn't been spending all their time and energy on appearance and housework? We'll never know, but we do know that human potential was wasted on a massive scale. Millions of intelligent, capable, creative women spent their lives in roles that didn't challenge them, didn't fulfill them, didn't allow them to contribute their unique gifts to the world. Let me share one more story that really illustrates this. There was a woman named Harriet who was interviewed for a documentary about the 1950s. Harriet had been accepted to medical school in 1949. Medical school. At a time when almost no women went to medical school, Harriet had been accepted based on her outstanding academic record. But she got married that same year. Her husband, to be told her she needed to choose medical school or marriage. He wasn't willing to support a wife who was going to medical school. He wanted a traditional wife at home. Harriet chose marriage. She spent the next 35 years as a housewife. In the interview done when she was in her 70s, she was asked if she regretted her choice. She started crying. She said, "I think about it almost every day. I could have been a doctor. I could have helped people, saved lives, contributed something meaningful. Instead, I hosted dinner parties and kept an immaculate house. And for what? My husband divorced me when I was 55 for a younger woman. I gave up my dreams for a marriage that didn't even last." How many Harriets were there? How many women gave up medical school, law school, PhD programs, artistic careers, scientific research for marriages that might or might not last? We can't count them. But they existed in numbers large, enough to represent a massive loss of human potential. And here's something, LSE to consider. The cost wasn't just borne by individual women. Society as ABR whole paid a price. When you systematically prevent half your population from fully participating in education, professional life, and civic engagement, you lose innovations that ever happen, discoveries that are never made, problems that never get solved, RT that never gets created. The 1950s was supposedly a golden age or America, but imagine how much more golden they could have been if women had been free to contribute fully. There's an economist who did a fascinating calculation trying to estimate the economic value of the unpaid domestic labor performed by housewives in the 1950s. If housewives had been paid for their labor at market rates, the total value would have been billions upon billions of dollars annually. This was an enormous amount of unpaid work. The EP'd the economy functioning, but was completely unrecognized and uncompensated. Women were providing free labor, and they were also spending significant money to maintain the appearance necessary to perform that labor acceptably. Think about the absurdity of that for a moment. You work 60 hours a week for and you also have to spend 10% of your family's income to look acceptable doing that free work. It's exploitative. It's unsustainable. And eventually, women figured that out. But here's what really gets me angry. All of Hessa costs. All of these sacrifices, all of this waste, it was sold to women as being for their own benefit, as being what they wanted, what would make them happy and fulfilled. The beauty industry, the fashion industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the media, they all profited enormously from women's oppression while telling women they were being liberated, being given the opportunity to be beautiful and feminine and fulfilled. It was gaslighting on a cultural scale. Women were being harmed while being told they should be grateful for the opportunity to be harmed. And the really insidious part, many women internalized these messages so completely that they policed themselves and each other. They didn't need men to enforce the standards because women enforced them on themselves and on other women. If a neighbor wasn't maintaining her appearance properly, other women would gossip. If a woman wasn't keeping her house immaculate, she would feel shame. Women had become their own jailers. Let me ask you something. Have you ever added up the cost of expectations in your own life? The things you feel you have to do, have to buy, have to be? What would you find if you calculated the time, money, and energy you spend on meeting standards that maybe don't even matter to you? I think we all have our own versions of this. Even today, the standards have changed, but the pressure to meet impossible ideals hasn't gone away. It's just taken different forms. So we've calculated the cost. We've seen the staggering amount of time, money, health, and opportunity that women sacrificed. And we've seen that these sacrifices didn't lead to happiness or fulfillment. They led to anxiety, depression, and a sense of emptiness. The system was broken. It was harming everyone involved. And that harm, that accumulated pain and waste across millions of women over decades, that's what eventually made change inevitable. Because here's the thing about unsustainable systems. They eventually collapse. The perfect housewife ideal of the 1950s contained tea, seeds of its own destruction. It demanded too much. It promised happiness while delivering misery. It claimed to honor women while oppressing them. And more women were starting to see through the lies, starting to count the costs, starting to ask whether the price was worth it. The cracks we talked about earlier, the small acts of resistance, they were spreading. The facade was crumbling. And that's what we need to explore next, because the story doesn't end in the 1950s. The rebellion that started as whispers would grow into a roar. The women who questioned quietly would stand up and shout. The system would fight back, but it would ultimately lose, because you cannot sustain a system built on denying the humanity of half the population. Eventually, inevitably, that system falls apart. And when it does, the change is seismic. That's where we're going next. Into the transformation, the upheaval, the long aftermath of the 1950s and how its ghosts still haunt us today. The 1960s arrived like a storm after years of suffocating calm. You could feel something shifting in the air. Young people were questioning everything their parents' generation had accepted as gospel truth. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. The anti-war movement was growing, and women, particularly younger women, were starting to say out loud what their mothers had only whispered. This isn't working. We want something different. We deserve something different. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It wasn't like everyone woke up on January 1st, 1960 and decided to abandon the perfect housewife ideal. Change never works that way. It's messy, slow, full of resistance and backlash. But by the mid to late 1960s, you could see the cracks widening into chasms. Fashion changed dramatically. The waspway silhouette that had dominated the 50 seconds started, giving way to straighter, more relaxed Ed-lines. Miniskirts appeared, which was scandalous. Young women started wearing pants regularly, even to work and social events. Hair got longer, more natural. The heavily made-up look of the 50s started to seem old-fashioned, overly artificial, and perhaps most importantly, girdles and corsets started to disappear. The younger generation simply refused to wear them. They rejected the idea that their bodies needed to be squeezed and shaped to be acceptable. In 1968, there was a protest at the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City. Feminist activists set up what they called a freedom trash can, where they threw bras, girdles, makeup, high heels, and women's magazines. They were symbolically rejecting all the tools of oppression that had defined femininity in the previous decades. The media, in typical fashion, misreported this as women burning their bras, which didn't actually happen, but the image of the bra-burning feminist entered popular culture and has persisted ever since, for better or worse. Let me tell you about a woman named Sandra who lived through this transition. She was born in 1945, so she was a teenager in the early 1960s and a young adult by the late 60s. Sandra's mother was a classic 1950s housewife, perfectly groomed, always in a dress and heels, maintained an immaculate home, never worked outside the house. Sandra was expected to follow the same path, but Sandra went to college in 1963, right when things were starting to change. She joined feminist discussion groups. She read The Feminine Mystique. She participated in protests and consciousness-raising sessions. When Sandra graduated in 1967, she did something her mother found shocking. She got a job and an apartment. She didn't get married right away. She wore pants and minimal makeup. She let her hair go natural. Her mother was horrified. She kept asking Sandra when she was going to settle down, find a nice man, start a family. But Sandra was charting a different course. She wanted a career. She wanted independence. She wanted to define her own version of womanhood rather than accepting the one that had been handed down to her. Sandra's story was repeated millions of times across America and Europe. Young women rejecting the patterns their mothers had lived. And this created enormous generational tension. Because remember, many of these mothers had sacrificed everything for the housewife role. They had endured pain and restriction and loss of self. And they had done it believing it was right. Believing it was what good women did. So when their daughters rejected that path, it felt like a rejection of the mothers themselves. It felt like their daughters were saying, "Your life was wasted. Your sacrifices were meaningless." That wasn't what the daughters were saying. Of course, they were saying, "We want different things. We want more options. We want freedom." But mothers often heard it as personal criticism, and that created rifts in families that sometimes never fully healed. The pain of the 1950s didn't end in the 50 seconds. It echoed through families for generations. But the changes of the 60s and 70s were real and significant. More women entered the workforce. By the 1970s, the number of working women had dramatically increased. Educational opportunities expanded. Title IX passed in 1972, prohibited sex discrimination in education, opening doors for women in sports and academic programs that had previously excluded them. Legal protections against workplace discrimination were enacted. Women gained more control over their reproductive choices with the legalization of birth control and, eventually, abortion rights. The beauty industry had to adapt. They couldn't sell the same perfect housewife image anymore because young women were explicitly rejecting it. So they pivoted. They started selling liberation instead of perfection. "You've come a long way, baby," as one famous cigarette ad proclaimed. The message became, "You're a modern woman, independent and free, and that's why you should buy our products." The tactics changed, but the underlying strategy didn't. They were still selling insecurity and dissatisfaction. They just packaged it differently. And here's where things get interesting, because in some ways, things got better. Women gained genuine freedoms and opportunities that their mothers and grandmothers never had. But in other ways, things got more complicated, because now women were expected to have it all: career and family, beauty and brains, independence and femininity. The pressure didn't disappear, it multiplied. Now you weren't just supposed to be a perfect housewife. You were supposed to be a perfect professional, a perfect wife, a perfect mother, and perfectly beautiful, all at the same time. Let me share some statistics that really illustrate this. In the 1950s, women spent an average of 24 hours per week on beauty and grooming. By the 1990s, working women were still spending approximately 15 to 18 hours weekly on appearance maintenance, despite having full-time jobs. They had added 40-plus hours of paid work to their week. But They had only reduced appearance maintenance by about 6 hours, so now they were working longer total hours than their housewife mothers, just in different ways. And the beauty standards themselves, they didn't get easier, they just changed. The hourglass figure gave way to different ideals. In the 1960s and 7S, the model Twiggy epitomized a new standard, extremely thin, almost boyish, with big eyes and short hair. In the 1980s, fitness became obsessed over, with toned, aerobicized bodies as the ideal. The 1990s brought heroin chic, celebrating an unhealthily thin aesthetic, and each new standard was presented as liberation as women, choosing how they wanted to look, even though the pressure to conform was just as intense as it had been in the 1950s. Have you noticed this? How each generation thinks they've escaped the beauty standards trap, but they've really just traded one set of impossible standards for another. The 1950s had the hourglass figure, the 90s had heroin chic. The 2000s had the extremely thin size zero ideal, and now we have Instagram face, BBL bodies, and a whole new set of procedures and products to buy. The game has changed, but we're still playing it. And then there's the pharmaceutical aspect. Remember those tranquilizers that were so prevalent in the 1950s? Miltown, Valium, Librium. Well, they didn't go away. They just got replaced by newer drugs. By the 1990s and 2000s, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, what we call SSRIs, became ubiquitous. Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, and who were the primary users? Women. By the early 2000s, approximately 25% of American women between ages 40 and 50 were taking antidepressants. 25%, 1 in 4. Now, I want to be careful here. Depression is a real illness. Antidepressants can be genuinely helpful for many people. This isn't about stigmatizing medication or suggesting that everyone on antidepressants doesn't need them, but it is worth asking, are a quarter of middle-aged women genuinely suffering from a brain chemistry imbalance, or are many of them, like their grandmother's generation, struggling with societal problems that are being treated as individual medical issues? Are we still prescribing pills to help women cope with impossible expectations, rather than changing the expectations? Let me tell you about a woman named Jennifer. She's a composite based on several interviews I've read, but her story is representative. Jennifer was born in 1975. Her mother had been a stay-at-home mom in the 1980s, but her mother had also been miserable, depressed, felt unfulfilled. So Jennifer was determined to have a career. She went to law school, became an attorney, got married, had 2 children. She was doing everything right. Supposedly, she had it all, except she was exhausted, constantly exhausted. She was working 50 to 60 hours weekly at her law firm. She was trying to be a present, engaged mother. She was trying to maintain her marriage. She was trying to look professional and put together. She was trying to keep her house reasonably clean and key healthy meals. She was trying to exercise to maintain her figure. She was trying to stay on top of her children's school activities and social schedules. It was too much, way too much. But when she went to her doctor complaining of exhaustion and feeling overwhelmed, what did the doctor prescribe? An antidepressant. Just like her grandmother might have been prescribed Valium in 1960. The parallels are striking, aren't they? Different decades, different drugs, same underlying problem. Women being asked to do too much, be too much, maintain too much. And when they can't keep up, when they crack under the pressure, they're told it's a personal failing requiring medical treatment rather than a societal problem requiring systemic change. And the beauty industry, oh, it's bigger than ever. In the 1950s, it was worth hundreds of millions. Now it's worth hundreds of billions globally. The tactics are more sophisticated. Instead of magazine ads, we have influencers and social media. Instead of being told to buy products to please our husbands, we're told to buy them for self-care, for self-love. But the result is the same. Women spending enormous amounts of time and money on their appearance, never feeling quite good enough, always needing the next product, the next procedure, the next improvement. Plastic surgery has exploded since the 1950s. Procedures that didn't exist or were extremely rare back then, like breast augmentation, liposuction, facelifts, Botox, fillers, they're now commonplace. Women are literally undergoing surgery to change their natural features to meet beauty standards, and the messaging around it has that same quality we saw in the 1950s. It's framed as empowerment, as women choosing to do what makes them feel good about themselves. But is it really choice when you're surrounded by images of altered bodies? When unaltered women are increasingly rare? In media, when not conforming means social and professional disadvantages. Let me ask you something. Do you think we've really come that far from the 1950s? Yes, women have more legal rights, more career opportunities, more options in theory, but are we actually freer? Or have we just added more obligations while keeping many of the old ones? The 1950s housewife had one impossible job. Being the perfect wife and mother, the modern woman has multiple impossible jobs. Perfect professional, perfect mother, perfect partner, perfect body, perfect social media presence. Is that progress? And here's something that really troubles me. The generational trauma of the 1950s persists in ways we don't always recognize. Daughters of 1950s housewives often absorbed their mother's anxieties about appearance, about perfection, about measuring up. Even daughters who consciously rejected the housewife role often found themselves struggling with the same insecurities, the same never good enough feelings. The trauma gets passed down, sometimes in obvious ways, sometimes in subtle ways. There's research on this now, studies on intergenerational trauma, on how patterns of anxiety and depression can be transmitted from mothers to daughters, not just through genetics, but through learned behaviors, through internalized messages about women's value and women's roles. The 1950s created a generation of women who suffered in specific ways. Those women raised daughters who often suffered in similar but differently expressed ways, and those daughters raised granddaughters who are still dealing with the aftermath. I spoke with a therapist who specializes in women's issues, and she told me something fascinating. She said that many of her clients, women in their 22nd and 30s, today are struggling with perfectionism, body image issues, and a deep sense of never being good enough. When she explores where these feelings come from, she often traces them back to grandmothers who were 1950s housewives. The grandmother passed anxiety to the mother, even if the mother took a different life path, and the mother, despite her best intentions, passed similar anxieties to the daughter. The specifics change, the standards shift, but the underlying message remains. You're not acceptable as you are. You need to be more, do more, look better, try harder. Breaking these patterns is hard work. It requires recognizing them, understanding where they came from, and consciously choosing different messages for ourselves and the next generation. But it's possible. The work that feminists have been doing since the 1960s, the consciousness raising, the questioning of standards, the insistence on women's full humanity that work matters. It changes things slowly but surely. The positive changes since the 1950s are real. Women can vote, own property, have credit cards in their own names, get divorced without being socially destroyed, work in most professions, control their reproduction. These are huge gains, but we can't pretend we've solved all the problems. The beauty industry is still manipulating women's insecurity for profit. Women are still judged more harshly on appearance than men. Women are still expected to perform emotional labor and household management in addition to paid work. Women are still dealing with the psychological aftermath of generations of being told they're not good enough. So, what's the answer? How do we finally break free from the shadow of the 1950s? How do we create a world where women are truly free to choose their own paths, define their own standards, live according to their own values rather than society's expectations. That's the question we need to grapple with, and it's going to require understanding not just what happened in the 1950s, but why it happened, DBH, at purposes it served, and what systems of power benefit from keeping women focused on appearance and inadequacy rather than on their own power and potential. That's the deeper analysis we need to explore, because until we understand the machinery behind the oppression, we can't fully dismantle it, and dismantling it is exactly what needs to happen. So let's look at the lessons, the takeaways, the wisdom that the housewives of the 1950s can teach us if we're willing to listen and learn. Because their struggle wasn't in vain. Their pain can become our wisdom if we honor it properly and use it to build something better. When you really sit with the story of the 1950s housewife, when you let it sink in, what lessons emerge? What can we learn from those women who suffered in silence, from those who spoke out, from those who found small ways to resist? I think there are some profound truths here that apply not just to beauty culture, but to how we navigate expectations and social pressure in our own lives today. So let's talk about what we can take away from all of this. Let's talk about how we can avoid repeating the same patterns, how we can recognize the traps before we fall into them. The first and perhaps most important lesson is this: learn to recognize when you're being sold a problem along with the solution. This is the fundamental trick of manipulative industries. They create or amplify insecurity, then offer you a product or service to fix that insecurity. The 1950s beauty industry perfected this. They told women their natural bodies were unacceptable, then sold them girdles and corsets. They told women their faces needed to be perfected, then sold them layers of makeup. They created the problem, then profited from the solution. And this tactic hasn't gone away. It's everywhere today. Social media influencers showing you their perfect lives while experiencing feelings of inadequacy, then selling you the products they use. Diet culture telling you your body is wrong, then selling you weight loss programs. Anti-aging companies telling you that looking your age is something to fear and fix, then selling you creams and procedures. The specifics change, but the pattern is the same. Create dissatisfaction, offer a solution, profit, repeat. So, how do you combat this? By asking critical questions before you buy into any message about what you should be or what you should have. Ask yourself, who benefits if I believe this message? Who makes money if I feel inadequate in this particular way? What am I being told is wrong with me? And is that actually true? Or is it manufactured? Let me give you a concrete example. You're scrolling through social media and you see an ad for a new skincare product. The ad shows women with absolutely flawless, poreless, glowing skin. The text suggests that if you have visible pores or texture or uneven tone, that's a problem that needs fixing. But, wait, pause there. Who says visible pores are a problem? Pores are normal. Every single human being has them. They're part of how your skin functions. But this ad is trying to convince you that normal skin is problematic, so you'll buy their product. That's manufactured insecurity. That's the same tactic the 1950s beauty industry used. Recognizing it is the first step to resisting it. The second lesson: systemic problems cannot be solved by individual solutions. This is crucial. The housewives of the 1950s were dealing with the systemic issue, the rigid gender roles, the limited opportunities, the social pressure. These were cultural and structural problems, but they were told that if they just tried harder, bought better products, took the right pills, they could be happy within that system. That was a lie. You cannot solve systemic oppression through individual effort and consumption. And we still see this today. Women are told that if they're struggling to balance work and family, they need better time management or better childcare, or to lean in more, or to take more self-care time. But the actual problem is that we have a system that expects women to do full-time paid work plus full-time domestic work plus full-time emotional labor, plus full-time appearance maintenance. That's not a time management problem. That's a structural problem that requires structural solutions like paid family leave, affordable childcare, equal division of domestic labor, and changing workplace cultures. So, when you find yourself struggling, feeling overwhelmed, feeling like you're not measuring up, pause and ask, is this a me problem or a systems problem? Am I failing or am I being set up to fail by impossible expectations? This distinction matters because it determines where you direct your energy. If it's a systemic problem, individual effort won't solve it. You need collective action, policy changes, cultural shifts. The third lesson is about the true cost of perfectionism. We've calculated the literal costs in time and money that 1950s housewives paid, but the deeper cost was psychological and spiritual. The cost of constantly monitoring yourself, judging yourself, trying to meet external standards rather than living according to your own values. That's exhausting. That's soul-destroying. And it prevents you from actually living your life because you're too busy managing how you appear. Perfectionism is often praised in our culture. We admire people who have high standards, who pay attention to details, who never seem to make mistakes. But perfectionism, when it's about meeting external standards rather than internal values, is actually a form of self-harm. It's a way of constantly telling yourself you're not good enough, and it keeps you focused on appearance, on surface, on meeting other people's expectations, rather than developing your own authentic self. So how do you break free from perfectionism? Start by identifying whose standards you're trying to meet. When you feel the anxiety about not being perfect enough, ask perfect according to whom. If your mother were to walk in right now, would she criticize this? Would your boss? Would strangers on the internet? And then ask the really important question, do I actually agree with that standard, or am I following it out of fear and habit? I'll share a personal realization that might resonate with you. I realized a few years ago that I was maintaining certain beauty routines, not because I actually cared about the results, but because I was afraid of being judged if I stopped. I was removing body hair because I thought everyone would think it was gross if I didn't, not because I personally cared whether I had body hair. When I interrogated that, I realized most people aren't even looking at me that closely, and the ones who are judging my body hair choices, why should their opinions dictate my decisions? That realization was liberating. I started making choices based on what I wanted rather than what I thought others expected. And you know what? The world didn't end. Most people didn't even notice. The fourth lesson, individual wellness, cannot come at the expense of social connection. The 1950s housewives were isolated in their suburbs, each one thinking she was the only one struggling, the only one unhappy. That isolation was part of what made the system so powerful. When you think you're alone in your suffering, you blame yourself. But when you connect with others and realize your experience is shared, you start to see the systemic nature of the problem. This is why consciousness-raising groups were so important to the feminist movement. Women sit in together, sharing their experiences, realizing that what they thought was a personal failing was actually a common experience caused by common pressures. That collective understanding was powerful. It transformed shame into anger and anger into action. And this applies today. When you're struggling, reach out, talk to other people. Share your experiences honestly without the Instagram filter, without the performance of having it all together. You will almost always find that other people are struggling with the same things, and that realization is both comforting and energizing. Comforting because you're not alone. Energizing because if multiple people are struggling with the same issue, that suggests it's not a personal failing. It's something that can be collectively addressed. The fifth lesson, question authority, especially medical authority. The 1950s housewives were prescribed tranquilizers by doctors who didn't question whether the problem might be societal rather than individual. Those doctors had authority. They were trusted, and they used that authority in ways that ultimately harmed women. This doesn't mean you should never trust doctors or other authorities, but it does mean you should ask questions, seek second opinions, and remember that authority figures are human. They have biases, blind spots, and sometimes financial incentives that don't align with your best interests. If a doctor prescribes you medication for anxiety or depression, it's worth asking, what else might help? Have we explored therapy, lifestyle changes, social support? Are there aspects of my life, circumstances that might be contributing to these feelings? A good doctor will engage with these questions. A doctor who just writes a prescription and sends you on your way might be missing important context, and this applies beyond medicine. When anyone in a position of authority tells you that you have a problem and they have the solution, especially if that solution costs money, pause and think critically. Beauty industry experts telling you your skin is aging and you need expensive treatments. Financial advisors telling you you're not investing enough. Self-help gurus telling you you're not productive enough. All of them might have valuable insights, but all of them also might have biases or incentives that don't serve you. The sixth lesson is about the economics of insecurity. Follow the money. Always follow the money. When you see a consistent message being pushed through multiple channels, telling you that you need to change something about yourself, ask who profits if I believe this. The 1950s beauty industry made billions by keeping women insecure. Today's beauty, diet, fashion, wellness, and self-improvement industries do the same thing. And here's the insidious part. These industries have gotten very good at co-opting the language of empowerment and self-care. They tell you that buying their products is an act of self-love, of taking care of yourself, of investing in yourself. But if that self-care is leaving you stressed about money, anxious about your appearance, and constantly focused on self-improvement, is it really caring for yourself, or is it just another way to extract money and energy from you? Real self-care, the kind that actually nourishes you, is usually cheap or free. Rest, time in nature, connecting with people you love, moving your body in ways that feel good, eating food that satisfies you, doing activities that engage your mind or creativity. These things don't generate profit for corporations, which is why you don't see them heavily advertised, but they're what actually contribute to well-being. The seventh lesson, define success on your own terms. The 1950s had a very clear definition of a successful woman. She was IED, had children, kept a beautiful home and maintained a perfect appearance. Women who didn't fit this definition, whether by choice or circumstance, were considered failures. But who decided that definition, and why should women accept it? Today, we have multiple competing definitions of success for women, which in some ways is progress. But many women feel pressure to achieve all of them simultaneously. Be professionally successful, have a perfect family, maintain a perfect body, have perfect style, be perfectly organized, have a perfect home. It's still an impossible standard, just a more complicated one. So, you need to define for yourself what success means. What do you actually value? Not what you think you should value. Not what your family or society tells you to value, but what you actually care about. Maybe you don't care about having a spotless home, but you do care about having time to read. Maybe you don't care about climbing the corporate ladder, but you do care about having flexible time with your kids. Maybe you don't care about looking 25 forever, but you do care about feeling strong and healthy in your body. Whatever your values are, they're valid, and a life lived according to your own values, even if it doesn't look impressive to others, is more successful than a life lived trying to meet other people's standards. The eighth lesson, self-awareness, requires removing the noise. The housewives of the 1950s were surrounded by messages about who they should be. Television, magazines, advertising, social pressure, all telling them the same thing. It was hard to hear their own thoughts, their own desires, their own sense of what they wanted from life. The noise was too loud. We face the same challenge today, maybe even more intensely. We're bombarded constantly with content, with opinions, with images of how other people are living. And all of that noise E makes it very hard to know what you actually think and want. So you need to create spaces of quiet. Times when you're not consuming content, not scrolling, not being marketed to. Times when you can hear your own thoughts. This might mean taking breaks from social media. It might mean limiting your news consumption. It might mean having device-free times or spaces in your life. It might mean spending time alone, just thinking or feeling without any external input. It sounds simple, but it's radical in our current culture, and it's necessary if you want to know yourself, rather than just absorb what others tell you about who you should be. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you had a full day without consuming any media? No television, no phone, no computer, no magazines, no podcasts, nothing. Just you and your own thoughts. If you can't remember, that might be worth examining. How can you know what you want if you never give yourself space to think about it without external influences? The 9th lesson: teach the next generation differently. The trauma and anxieties of the 1950s got passed down to subsequent generations. The women who suffered under those standards often unintentionally pass similar anxieties to their daughters and granddaughters. Breaking these patterns requires conscious effort. If you have children, especially daughters, think carefully about the messages you're sending them about appearance, about worth, about success. Are you modeling self-acceptance, or are you modeling constant self-criticism? Are you teaching them to question beauty standards, or are you reinforcing them? Are you showing them that women's value comes from their character and capabilities, or are you inadvertently suggesting that looks matter most? This doesn't mean you can't care about appearance at all. It means being intentional and thoughtful about it. It means X. Planing context. When you see manipulative advertising, it means talking about the difference between grooming for hygiene or professional requirements versus trying to achieve impossible beauty standards. It means showing them examples of women who are valued for things other than appearance, and it means being gentle with yourself when you mess up, because you will. We're all products of the culture we grew up in. We all absorbed messages that we're now trying to unlearn. What matters is the effort, the awareness, the willingness to do better and teach better than what we were taught. The 10th and final lesson, the one that encompasses all the others, is this: your humanity is not conditional. You don't have to earn the right to take up space, to be heard, to be valued. You don't have to be beautiful enough, thin enough, accomplished enough, perfect enough. Your worth is inherent. It exists simply because you exist. The 1950s tried to teach women that their value was contingent on meeting certain standards. That was wrong then, and it's wrong now. This is perhaps the hardest lesson to internalize, because we're surrounded by messages that suggest the opposite. But it's the most important, because once you truly believe in your inherent worth, once you really integrate that truth into how you see yourself, the manipulative messages lose their power. They can't make you feel inadequate, because you know you're already adequate, already valuable, already enough. So these are the lessons. Recognize manufactured insecurity. Understand that systemic problems need systemic solutions. Count the cost of perfectionism. Build community and connection. Question authority. Follow the money. Define success on your own terms. Create space for self-awareness. Teach the next generation better patterns. And remember your inherent worth. These aren't easy lessons. They require ongoing work, constant vigilance, and a willingness to go against cultural currents. But they're worth it. Because the alternative is repeating the cycles, suffering the same patterns, wasting your precious life trying to meet standards that were designed to keep you small and insecure. And that's the final thing we need to talk about after all these lessons, after understanding the past and present. What comes next? How do we actually move forward? How do we build something better? Something that honors women's full humanity instead of exploiting their insecurity. That's where we need to end this journey, with hope and a vision for what could be different. Because the story of the 1950s housewife doesn't have to be our story. we can write something new. So, where does this leave us? We've traveled through decades now, from the perfectly coiffed housewives of the 1950s to the complicated present we inhabit today. We've seen the pain, the cost, the resistance, the lessons. But what do we do with all of this understanding? How do we actually create change, not just in society at large, but in our own lives right now, today? That's what I want to talk about as we close this story, because understanding the past is only valuable if it helps us build a better future. First, let's acknowledge something important. Change is happening. It's slow, it's uneven, it's messy, but it's real. The body positivity movement, for all its flaws and complications, has created space for more diverse representations of beauty. Women and girls are seeing bodies that look like theirs in media more than ever before. That matters. The conversation about mental health has opened up dramatically. People are talking about therapy, about trauma, about the societal sources of psychological distress. That's progress. More women are in positions of power, able to make decisions that affect other women's lives. That's significant. And younger generations are questioning things that previous generations accepted. They're calling out sexism more directly. They're rejecting certain beauty standards more vocally. They're demanding better from employers, from partners, from institutions. Every generation stands on the shoulders of the ones before, and the work that feminists have been doing since the 1960s has created foundations that younger women are building on. But we also need to be honest about what hasn't changed. The fundamental economic model of creating insecurity to sell solutions, that's still going strong, just with more sophisticated tactics. The expectation that women should perform multiple full-time roles simultaneously, that hasn't gone away. The judgment of women based primarily on appearance, rather than character or capabilities, still pervasive. The patterns of trauma and anxiety being passed down through generations still happening. So, we're in this interesting place where some things are better, some things are different, and some core problems persist in new forms, which means the work isn't done, not even close. But that's okay. Social change is a marathon, not a sprint. What matters is that we keep moving in the right direction, keep learning, keep questioning, keep refusing to accept the unacceptable. Let me tell you about a conversation I had recently. I was talking with a woman in her early 22nd. She was telling me about her struggle with social media, how she spends hours taking and editing photos, how she feels anxious when posts don't get enough likes, how she compares herself constantly to influencers with perfect lives. And as she talked, I heard echoes of the 1950s Housewives, different technology, different specific pressures, but the same underlying pattern: external validation, performance of perfection, constant inadequacy, the fear of not measuring you. So I asked her, what would happen if you just stopped? If you deleted the apps and lived your life without documenting it? She looked shocked, like I'd suggested something radical. But then, how would people know what I'm doing? How would I stay connected? And there it was, the same trap in a new form. The belief that your value is determined by how others perceive you, that your experiences only matter if they're witnessed and approved by others. It's the 1950s housewife, maintaining her appearance for the neighbors and her husband, just translated into the digital age. But here's the hopeful part. Once we named the pattern, once she saw the connection, she started thinking differently. She started asking herself the same questions we've been exploring. Who benefits from my anxiety about likes and followers? What am I actually getting from this constant performance? What would I rather be doing with those hours? She hasn't deleted her accounts. Not yet. But she's thinking about it differently. She's recognizing the manipulation. And that's the first step. That's what I hope you take from this story, not guilt about the ways you might be participating in these systems. We all are to some degree. We're all products of our culture, and it's hard to stand completely outside cultural forces. But awareness, the ability to See the patterns, recognize the manipulation, question the standards you're measuring yourself against. That awareness is power. It gives you the ability to make different choices, even small ones. Maybe you decide to spend 30 minutes less on your appearance routine and 30 minutes more on something that actually feeds your soul. Maybe you stop buying magazines that make you feel bad about yourself. Maybe you unfollow accounts on social media that trigger comparison and inadequacy. Maybe you talk honestly with friends about your struggles instead of RMing perfection. Maybe you teach your children to question advertising instead of absorbing it uncritically. These seem like small acts, but they add up. Every time you refuse to participate in a system that profits from your insecurity, you weaken that system just a little bit. And when enough people make these small refusals, when enough people opt out of the game itself starts to change. That's how the perfect housewife ideal eventually crumbled. Not because of one dramatic moment, but because more and more women, in small ways and large ways, said, no, I won't wear the girdle. No, I won't take the pills. No, I won't pretend to be happy when I'm miserable. No, I won't sacrifice my education for marriage. No, I won't stay silent about my struggles. Each no was an act of resistance, and together those refusals created momentum for real change. So what does moving forward look like practically? I think it starts with 3 commitments. First, the commitment to self-knowledge, really knowing yourself, your values, your desires, separate from what you've been told you should want. This requires that quiet time we talked about, time away from external messages, time to think and feel without being marketed. 2, it requires honesty with yourself about what actually makes you happy versus what you think should make you happy, and it requires accepting that your truth might not look like anyone else's truth, and that's okay. Second, the commitment to community, not performing for others, but genuinely connecting with others. Finding people you can be honest with, who you don't have to perform perfection for. Building relationships based on authenticity rather than image. This is counter to so much of our current culture, which rewards performance and image over substance, but it's essential for well-being. The 1950s housewives suffered in isolation. We don't have to repeat that pattern. We can build support systems, share our struggles, learn from each other. And third, the commitment to collective action, because while individual choices matter, they're not enough. We need systemic changes. We need policy changes that support actual work-life balance, that provide childcare support, that mandate equal pay, that protect people from discrimination. We need cultural changes in how we talk about women, how we represent women in media, how we value women's contributions. We need economic changes that don't rely on exploiting women's insecurity for profit. This requires political engagement, voting for candidates who support these policies, supporting organizations working for change, speaking out when you see injustice, using whatever platform or influence you have, however small, to push for better. It's easy to feel like individual action doesn't matter in the face of huge systemic problems, but movements are built from individual actions. Every person who shows up, speaks out, refuses to comply, that matters. Let me share one final story with you. I came across this in my research and it stayed with me. There was a woman interviewed in her 90 seconds who had been a 1950s housewife. She was asked what advice she would give to her younger self. Knowing everything she knew now, she thought for a long moment. Then she said, I would tell her to be brave, to trust her own instincts more than other people's expectations, to know that the discomfort of being different is better than the misery of pretending to be something you're not. I would tell her that she's enough exactly as she is, and that spending her life trying to be enough for others is a waste of the precious time she has. Then she paused and added, but I would also tell her to be gentle with herself because she's doing the best she can with what she knows in the world she's living. And that has to be enough too. I think about that advice often. Be brave. Trust yourself. Know your worth, but also be gentle with yourself. We're all navigating impossible expectations and confusing messages. We're all carrying wounds from the past, our own and our ancestors. We're all trying to figure out how to live authentically in a world that often rewards performance over substance. That's hard work. So yes, question the standards, refuse the manipulation, resist the pressure, but also give yourself grace when you slip up, when you catch yourself falling into old patterns, when you struggle. The housewives of the 1950s couldn't see the full picture of what was being done to them. They didn't have the frameworks we have now for understanding systemic oppression. They didn't have the movements and communities and research that we have access to. They were doing the best they could with what they had, and many of them, despite everything working against them, still found ways to resist, to maintain some sense of self, to plant seeds for change. We stand on their shoulders now. We have the benefit of their experience, their pain, their resistance. We can learn from what they went through so we don't have to repeat it. That's the gift they've given us. Even though they probably didn't know they were giving it at the time, their struggle wasn't meaningless. Their suffering has become our wisdom if we choose to receive it and learn from it. So, as we close this long journey through the hidden world of the 1950s housewife, I want you to remember a few key truths. Your worth is not conditional. You don't have to earn the right to exist, to take up space, to have needs and desires and dreams. You are enough right now as you are. Not once you lose 10 or get the promotion or buy the right products or achieve the perfect look. Right now, this moment, enough. The S. Systems that tell you otherwise, that try to convince you that you're inadequate and need to purchase their solution. Those systems are lying to you for profit. See them, name them, refuse them when you can, and when you can't, refuse them entirely, because we all have to navigate the world we live in. At least see them clearly. Don't let them colonize your sense of self-worth. Connect with others authentically. Build communities of honesty. Share your struggles. Listen to others' struggles. Recognize that we're all in this together. And collective understanding leads to collective action, which leads to real change. Question everything. The beauty standards, the life scripts, the definitions of success, the authorities telling you what you should be. Question it all. Not in a cynical, distrustful way, but in a curious, analytical way. Ask whose interests are served by these standards. Follow the money. Think critically, and finally, honor the women who came before us by living differently than they were allowed to live. Every time you choose authenticity over performance, freedom over restriction, self-knowledge over external validation, you're honoring their struggle. You're saying your pain meant something. The courage you showed, even in small ways, even when no one noticed, that mattered. And I'm going to live the life you couldn't in your honor. The perfect housewife of the 1950s was a myth, an impossible standard that harmed everyone who tried to achieve it. But the women who lived through that era, who suffered under those standards, who found ways to resist and survive and eventually rebel, they were real. Their experiences matter. Their stories deserve to be told and remembered and learned from. So, thank you for taking this journey with me tonight. Thank you for listening to these stories, for sitting with the discomfort of recognizing patterns that might exist in your own life, for being willing to question and think and consider. These conversations matter. This awareness matters. You matter. I hope you'll take something from this story into your own life. Maybe it's a question you'll ask yourself. Maybe it's a pattern you'll start to recognize. Maybe it's a small refusal you'll make. Maybe it's just a sense of connection to women across time who have struggled with similar pressures. Whatever it is, it matters. The story of the 1950s housewife is a story about the human cost of impossible expectations, about the ways systems exploit insecurity for profit, about suffering and resistance and eventual change. But it's also a story about resilience, about the human spirit's refusal to be completely crushed, about small acts of courage that eventually create big shifts. And that story isn't over. We're still living it, still writing it, still figuring out what comes next. The perfect housewife is gone, but we're still negotiating what women's freedom and equality actually look like in practice. We're still fighting against new forms of old oppressions. We're still learning, still growing, still becoming. So take care of yourself. Be gentle with yourself, but also be brave. Question the standards. Refuse the manipulation. Connect with others. Build something better. You have the power to write your own story, even within the constraints we all face. Use that power wisely. The women of the 1950s didn't have all the choices we have, but we do. And that means we have a responsibility to use those choices well, to honor their struggle by living more freely, more authentically, more fully than they were allowed to live. Sweet dreams, my friends. Rest well. And when you wake up, maybe look at the world with slightly different eyes. See the patterns, question the messages, remember your worth, and know that you're part of a long line of women who've been asking these questions, fighting these battles, creating change, step by step, generation by generation. Thank you for being here with me tonight. Thank you for listening, for thinking, for caring. I'll be back soon with another story, another journey through history's hidden corners, another exploration of the human experience in all its complexity and beauty and pain. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other. Good night.